On the afternoon of the 10th of June, 1871, a defense attorney named Clement Vallandigham was sitting inside a courtroom in Lebanon, Ohio. He was listening to a prosecutor question a witness on the stand. And with every single word this witness spoke, Clement could feel the knot in his stomach twist and tighten just a little bit more. This testimony was not just bad, it was devastating for Clement's client, a man named Thomas McGahan, who was on trial for murder. The murder itself had happened about 6 months earlier on a cold Christmas Eve in the nearby city of Hamilton. That night, McGahan had apparently stormed into a saloon with a group of his friends. Their target was another man inside named Tom Myers. An attack broke out, it was loud, it was chaotic, and in the middle of all the shouting and shoving, a single gunshot rang out. When the chaos finally died down, Tom Myers was on the floor, shot and killed. Now, the problem was, there were at least 30 other people in that saloon at the time. But the fight had happened so fast and it was so confusing that not a single person could say for sure that they saw who actually fired the gun. Despite this complete lack of a direct witness to the shooting, almost everyone in town immediately decided that Thomas McGahan had done it. And to be fair, even Clement had to admit that it was a reasonable assumption to make. You see, McGahan and the victim Tom Myers had a very long and very public history of not liking each other. It was a well-known feud, and everybody in town knew they hated each other. On top of that, McGahan had a reputation. He was known as a violent criminal, and there were rumors, whispers that he had already killed at least 4 other men in his lifetime. So, when Tom Myers ended up dead after a fight with McGahan, the citizens of Hamilton didn't really feel the need to wait around for a trial. They were ready to form a mob and hang McGahan right then and there. Of course, the local police intervened before that could happen. They arrested McGahan and put him in jail to await trial. But the story of the saloon murder had already spread like wildfire all across Ohio. It was a messy, dramatic case with a notorious defendant, and as a result, the trial itself became a very high-profile event. Every single day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists from all over the state, important local figures, and curious members of the public all came to sit in the gallery and listen to the testimony unfold. And right now, all of these important people were sitting there watching Clement's defense case get absolutely obliterated by this one single witness. The witness on the stand was one of the men who had been in the saloon on the night of the murder. And he was making a very, very big claim. He was telling the court that even though nobody saw McGahan fire a gun, he was certain McGahan was the shooter. The witness said that right after the gunshot went off, he looked over and he saw a little puff of smoke coming out of McGahan's jacket pocket. The implication was clear. McGahan had his gun hidden inside his jacket, and he had fired it through the fabric to conceal the weapon. As the witness explained this theory, Clement looked around the courtroom. He saw people in the jury box nodding their heads. He saw journalists in the gallery scribbling furiously in their notepads. It was clear that everyone was buying it. What the witness said seemed to make perfect sense to them. At that point, Clement could tell that basically everyone in that room thought his client was guilty. But Clement did not agree. He knew his client's case looked terrible. He knew the public opinion was stacked against him. But Clement was absolutely certain deep down in his gut that Thomas McGahan was innocent. Clement had his own theory about what had happened that night in the saloon. He believed that the victim, Tom Myers, had actually shot himself by accident. He thought that during the chaotic brawl, Myers had tried to pull out his own gun to defend himself, but in the struggle he fumbled it and the gun went off, killing him. Unfortunately for Clement, this was 1,871. There was no advanced forensic science. There were no ballistics experts or gunshot residue tests. The only piece of physical evidence in the entire case was a few scorch marks on Tom Myers' shirt where the bullet had entered. So, the whole trial was really just based on what the witnesses said, and this particular witness was being very, very convincing for the prosecution. The prosecutor finished up his questioning with a confident flourish. He walked back to his table with a little smirk on his face, like he knew he had just landed the winning blow. He had pretty much just won the entire case with that one testimony. Now it was Clement's turn to cross-examine the witness. And honestly, he had no idea how it was going to go. He felt like he was facing a brick wall. But as Clement stood up from his chair and started to walk across the courtroom floor, a strange sense of calm came over him. He was thinking to himself, I really don't have that much to lose here. Pretty much everyone in this state already thinks my client is a murderer. So if he's found guilty, nobody is going to be shocked. But maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to prove he's innocent. And that would be a huge victory. And if I don't, well, it is what it is. To understand Clement's mindset, you have to know that he was a very controversial figure in Ohio at that time, which was right after the end of the Civil War. During the war, he had been a very vocal opponent of the president, Abraham Lincoln. His political viewpoints had actually gotten him banished from Ohio and the other northern states for a time. After the war ended, he was allowed to return to his home state of Ohio, and he went back to practicing law. But he had never really been able to fix his damaged public image. Even now, 6 years later, a lot of people in Ohio still really hated him for his behavior during the war. So in his mind, Clement knew that losing this case wasn't going to change much for him personally. Nothing would really change. He'd still be the guy that a lot of people disliked, and his client would be the convicted murderer everyone already thought he was. It is what it is. But if he won, if he could somehow pull off an acquittal in this impossible case, he could completely reinvent himself. He would no longer be the disgraced politician. He would be known as the sensational criminal defense lawyer who could overturn even the most hopeless cases. And again, he genuinely believed his client was innocent. So this would be a major victory on two fronts for Clement. It would be a professional triumph and a personal vindication. So, with this renewed sense of purpose, Clement stepped up to the witness box. He began firing off one question after another at the witness. By the end of the day, Clement had managed to get that witness to admit that he hadn't actually seen a physical gun in McGeehan's hand or in his pocket. He had only seen the smoke. Then, Clement delivered his final blow to the prosecution's theory. He had the jacket that McGeehan had been wearing that night brought into the court as evidence. He showed it to the judge and the jury, and he was able to prove that there was no hole anywhere on it. Not a single tear or burn mark. The jacket shooting theory was completely destroyed. As the week went on, more and more witnesses took the stand. Clement was pleased to find that none of them had any actual proof that McGeehan had shot Tom Myers. But, on the other hand, he also couldn't find any solid evidence that proved his client was innocent either. He had poked holes in the prosecution's case, but he hadn't built a strong case of his own. So, later that week, on Friday, June 16th, as the trial was coming to a close, Clement was starting to get worried again. He knew that he had done a lot, but he also knew it probably wasn't enough to get his client acquitted. And even though he knew the odds were always stacked against him, he now felt like victory was possible. It was almost within his grasp, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. That afternoon, Clement sat behind the defense table, sweating under his collar as he listened to the prosecutor's team deliver their closing arguments. And they were brutal. They painted McGeehan as a cold-blooded killer and tore apart every little bit of doubt Clement had tried to create. This was giving Clement a lot of anxiety. He was just moments away from having to give his own closing arguments. This was his very last chance to convince the jury that his client was innocent. But he just did not feel like the speech he had prepared was going to be enough, especially not after the powerful and convincing speech the prosecutor was giving right now. And so, as the prosecutor eloquently wrapped up his speech, Clement was furiously crossing out lines on his own notes, trying to rewrite things, trying to make it better, stronger. But nothing was coming to him. He just sat there, racking his brain, trying to think of what to say. The prosecutor sat down, and the entire courtroom fell silent. Everybody was looking at Clement, waiting for him to stand up and deliver his closing argument. And as he sat there in that heavy silence, an idea suddenly hit him. It hit him so hard that he actually dropped his pen on the floor. He didn't know why this idea hadn't occurred to him earlier. It was so obvious. He suddenly realized there was a way he could definitively prove McGeehan was innocent. And if he was right, he would go down in history as perhaps the greatest defense attorney Ohio had ever seen. Clement lunged for his pen again. He frantically started scribbling down the details of his new idea. A minute later, he heard the judge call his name, telling him it was his turn to speak. And so he shot to his feet and he cleared his throat. But instead of launching into the speech he had prepared for this moment, he did something unexpected. He asked the judge to let him deliver his closing argument on Monday instead. The judge was a little hesitant at first, but after some consideration, he agreed. And when he did, Clement felt a huge surge of excitement rush through his body. After the court proceedings officially ended for the day, Clement could not get out of that courthouse fast enough. He had a plan, and he needed to put it into motion. Clement waited until nightfall to act. He needed to run a test to make sure his theory, the one he was going to present on Monday, was correct. But he didn't want anyone from the prosecution team to see him doing it. So, after having dinner with some friends, Clement slipped out of his hotel and into the quiet, dark streets of Lebanon. While he was at dinner, he had been pretty vague about what he actually planned to do that night. But he did tell his friends that they really needed to stay in town long enough to hear his big final argument on Monday. He was that confident in what he was about to uncover. He was sure his speech on Monday would be one of the greatest legal moments in the history of Ohio. And so now, as Clement made his way to the edge of town, he was filled with adrenaline. He kept walking faster and faster until he was basically at a full run. And then he finally arrived at a quiet, isolated part of Lebanon. As soon as he got there, he set up for the test he had planned, and then he ran through it. After he finished, a wide smile spread across Clement's face. He knew, without a single doubt, that he had just found a way to prove that his client was innocent. Just a few minutes later, around 9 o'clock that evening, Clement was back inside of his hotel room. He was so excited about the results of his test that he couldn't even sit down. He just kept pacing back and forth around and around the small room, trying to get his thoughts in order, but he was just too excited. His hotel room door was cracked open, and as he was pacing, he saw his co-counsel, another lawyer on the defense team, walking by in the hallway. This hotel was sort of the home base for everyone who was in town for the trial. So most of the lawyers from both the prosecution and the defense teams were staying there. When Clement saw his co-counsel, he immediately waved him inside. He tried to tell him what he had figured out, but the words just kind of tumbled out in a jumbled mess. All he really managed to get across was that the prosecution had it all wrong, and that he, Clement, had figured out the truth. But his co-counsel was just looking at him with a confused expression, like he really didn't understand a word he was saying. And so, at some point, Clement realized that words weren't going to be enough. He needed to do a physical demonstration. He needed to repeat the test he had just done out in the field to actually show his co-counsel exactly what he was talking about. So, without much more explanation, Clement got up. He set up the test right there in the hotel room. He then turned to his co-counsel and told him to watch carefully. And then Clement began to perform the test. But this time, something went horribly wrong. During the demonstration, there was a sudden, loud explosion, and Clement collapsed to the ground. It would turn out that Clement's test did prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that his client really was innocent. His theory was that Tom Myers had shot himself by accident, by fumbling with his own gun. But in order to make sure his theory would hold up with the jury, he wanted to show everyone that it was definitely physically possible for that to happen. So, when Clement had gone to the edge of town to do the test by himself for the first time, he had taken a gun with him. He basically experimented with ways the accident could have happened. He shot the gun through pieces of fabric from different angles, and he looked at the resulting scorch marks. And when he did this, he realized that the scorch marks that had been left on the victim's clothes, which was the only forensic evidence they had, could have only been made if the victim was shot at point-blank range. This meant that Thomas McGeehan, who was standing several feet away during the fight, was simply too far away to have been the shooter. But it was not until later, when Clement acted out the shooting again for his co-counsel in the hotel room, that his discovery went from great to perfect. Because completely by accident, he did exactly what he believed Tom Myers had done that night. He fumbled with the gun, and he shot himself. Clement died from his self-inflicted wound 12 hours later. But his death made his argument so powerful and so convincing that his client, Thomas McGahan, was eventually acquitted. So Clement had been right. This was the greatest case of his life. It was also his last. Our second and final story is about a song, but we're not going to be playing this song during the episode. And when you get to the end of this story, you'll see why. On an overcast, chilly Sunday in the fall of 1932, a 32-year-old composer named Rezo Cherish sat in his small apartment in Paris trying to write a new melody. He had been at it for hours and hours, and it was not going well at all. Each time he managed to jot down a new combination of notes, he would play it back, hate it, and then tear up the sheet of paper and toss it into his trash bin. The bin was already overflowing with a pile of other discarded drafts. Now, Rezo was used to this kind of messy, creative process. He had made a name for himself as a musician back in his home country of Hungary over the last decade. He had written more than 40 different musical compositions for various singers and artists, and a few of them had been really successful. So Rezo knew, deep down, that he had the talent to be a huge star. He believed he could change people's lives with his music. But recently, despite trying many different approaches and just letting the messy creative process happen, Rezo still could not come up with any new work that he felt was any good. A big part of the problem was that he was incredibly stressed out. At this point in 1932, Rezo and many other people were very nervous about the state of the world and what the future might hold. There were very violent and hateful political views that were spreading across Europe, especially in Germany. This was still 7 years before the official start of World War II, but Hitler and his Nazi party were already starting to gain a lot of power. And Rezo, who was Jewish, was deeply worried about all the anti-Jewish rhetoric that the Nazis were spreading. And while that was terrifying and kept him up at night, the more urgent day-to-day worry that was really blocking his creativity was a more practical one: how to literally afford to buy food. The world was also in the middle of the Great Depression, which was a period of time in the 1920s and 30s when multiple countries were dealing with terrible economies and massive unemployment. Back in Rezo's home country of Hungary, things were especially bad, and they were getting worse every day. Banks and businesses were closing down almost daily. More than a quarter of the entire population was unemployed and living in extreme poverty. Rezo had moved to Paris, hoping to find more opportunities. Paris, after all, was considered the art mecca of Europe. And even though the state of the world felt depressing and dark, Rezo thought that the creative energy in Paris would inspire him to create something beautiful in the middle of all the darkness. But now, as Rezo sighed and leaned back in his chair, he looked around his tiny, drafty Parisian apartment. He had been here for months, and his fortunes had certainly not changed. He still didn't have any work, and he still could not seem to write anything good. But Rezo, he kept trying. He would lean back over his piano and try to write, but almost immediately he would tear up the paper. He was just getting more and more frustrated with himself until finally he just gave up. He put his head in his hands and basically said out loud, "I can't do this." It seemed like the harder he worked and the harder he tried to ignore all the despair and sadness and the awful things that were going on in the world, the worse he felt. And obviously, the worse his work was. Right now, he actually almost felt physically sick from bottling up all of these terrible competing feelings and thoughts. But as he thought about the fact that he was bottling everything up, he suddenly decided he just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't continue to keep all of that stuff locked inside. And it was at that exact moment that Rezo took a deep breath and he let in all of the anguish that he had been trying so hard to push away. Sadness and fear and a quiet sense of desperation just washed over him and into him. And this time, he didn't fight it. He just let it happen. And then suddenly, he started writing. His pen flew across the page as wave after wave of these terrible emotions hit him. When he was done, he ran over to his piano to play the notes that he had just written down. And as his fingers moved across the keys, a very slow, very sad melody began to fill the small room. It was so beautiful and so incredibly sad that he actually felt like he was going to cry just from hearing it himself. When he was done playing, he just sat back in his chair. And now, tears were filling his eyes, and his heart was pounding so fast that he knew he needed to get some fresh air, and fast, or he might actually just pass out. And so Rezo went outside to take a walk. He hoped the fresh air would help him snap out of the wild emotional fog that had just come over him. But the Paris streets were gray and cold, and this new melody just continued to ring in his ears. He was thrilled that he had actually written something real and powerful for the first time in what felt like a very long time. But it was such an intense expression of his own personal sadness that it almost hurt to have created it. Shortly into his walk, he heard somebody call his name. When he looked up, he saw it was his good friend, a poet named Yo Yavor, who was rushing right up to him. And right away, when Rezo saw his friend, he felt himself lightening up just a little bit. He liked Laszlo. They were both Hungarians living in Paris, trying to make good art and make a name for themselves, but neither of them had really succeeded yet. But as soon as Laszlo reached him, Rezo could tell that his friend seemed really upset about something too. His friend told him that his fiancée had just ended their engagement, and he was completely heartbroken. After Rezo said that he was terribly sorry to hear that, the two men just walked together in silence for a while. They were both lost in their own sad, heavy feelings, and neither of them could think of anything to say. And then, without even meaning to, Rezo just began to whistle the song that he had just written. And when he did this, it was like the tune had an immediate effect on Laszlo. His friend's eyes welled up with tears, and he sort of began to cry. And also, he began to sing along to the melody using words from a very sad poem that he himself had recently written. Rezo couldn't believe it. Without even trying, Laszlo's words were a perfect fit for his melody. And as this sort of impromptu collaboration began, the two men went from this really dark, gloomy mood to a purely excited one. They were so inspired that they rushed into a nearby restaurant to sit down and work out the rest of the song. Before they knew it, Rezo had written an entire composition with Laszlo's lyrics. The song was about someone whose lover had just died, and their deep desire to be reunited with them in the afterlife, Pakis. When the men finished, they wanted to hear their new song out loud. So they asked the restaurant's resident musicians if they would play it for them. And pretty soon, their song, something that hadn't even existed just a few hours ago, was being played throughout the crowded restaurant. And as far as Rezo and Laszlo could tell, everybody inside was loving this song. Some of the restaurant patrons actually started to cry. Others closed their eyes and just kind of swayed to the sad sound. It was exactly what Rezo had always hoped his music would do, which was to truly and deeply affect those who heard it. Rezo and Laszlo looked at each other, and for the first time in days, they both smiled. Rezo and Laszlo decided to call their song Gloomy Sunday since it had been created on that hazy fall Sunday. They both had a feeling that this particular tune was very special, and that it would finally be the thing that changed both of their lives for the better. So, over the next few months, they took the song around to different music producers and tried to get somebody to buy it. And finally, someone did. A company agreed to publish the sheet music and to record the song. After that, Rezo went back to his shabby Parisian apartment, and he waited. He waited for the song to take hold, for it to become a hit, and for the money to start pouring in. But that is not what happened. As the months passed by, Rezo didn't hear Gloomy Sunday on the radio. He didn't see it on any music charts. He didn't hear it in other restaurants or being performed in theaters. It was like the song had never even existed at all. And this completely crushed Rezo. He was even more upset and defeated than he had been before he had written it, because now he had gotten a taste of hope. And it felt so much worse to fail after that. The rest of Rezo's life, and the state of the world, got worse too. The Great Depression was still going strong. And as Hitler got more and more popular, people started to wonder if there was going to be a major war. So Rezo and pretty much everyone else around him just sank further and further into their fears and worries and kept praying for something, anything, to change. 3 years later, on a spring evening in 1935, Rezo was back in Hungary. He was walking down a street in the country's capital city, Budapest. He was on his way to a friend's house. But as he strolled down the sidewalk, he heard a song coming from an open window of a nearby apartment. He stopped cold in his tracks, and his heart began to pound in his chest, because he knew that song. It was his. It was Gloomy Sunday. Rezo had no idea how or why he was hearing his song. As far as he knew, no one had really been that interested in it. But it was completely shocking. Someone he didn't know was listening to his song on the radio. That meant it was being put out on the airwaves, that it was being consumed by the public. This was incredible. And so Rezo just stood there on the sidewalk, letting his own notes wash over him, hearing it out in public for the very first time. And when the song was done, he just stood there for another moment and just absolutely beamed with joy. After that day, for months, Gloomy Sunday was everywhere. Rezo heard it being played at social gatherings. He heard it streaming from people's windows. Street performers sang it to people passing by, and it was even performed at big concert venues all over the city. And so by the end of that year, it seemed like there was hardly anyone in all of Hungary who hadn't heard and loved his song. Rezo even read in the newspapers that his song was being played in England, in France, and as far away as the United States. So Rezo knew that he had actually done it. He had finally realized his dream of being a successful, internationally recognized composer with a hit song that truly resonated with the public. A few months later, on a morning in late February of 1936, Rezo left his apartment and was heading out for the day. And on his way down the street, he passed by a newsstand. He happened to notice that one of the headlines mentioned his song Gloomy Sunday. Initially, he was really excited to see that he was getting some press coverage. So, he immediately grabbed a copy of the newspaper and opened it up to read the article. But as his eyes scanned the page, his stomach completely flipped. Because this was not good press. In fact, what this article had to say was so terrible that Rezo's first reaction was that he must have read it wrong. And so, he read it again, and then a third time, and then a fourth time. But each time he read it, it just said the same horrible thing. And so Rezo found himself starting to panic. He quickly shut the paper and just began looking around him. He saw there were a few other people who were also standing by the newsstand, and they were reading the same paper. And they were all talking to one another in hushed, worried voices and pointing at that same headline about his song. And Rezo just stood there, listening to this unsettling murmur and feeling a wave of absolute horror wash over him. Over the next month, more and more headlines about Rezo's song continued to appear in the papers. And it was like each day, they only got worse. And then the story went international. The Catholic Church weighed in on it. And then the police got involved. Finally, one afternoon at the end of March in 1936, Rezo was sitting at his piano, just staring down at the keys. He knew he should be writing music, but instead he was just filled with a sense of dread, just like he had been every single day since he first read that dreadful headline. And then suddenly, there was a sharp knock at his door. And when Rezo got up and answered it, a cold sweat broke out all over his body because it was the Budapest police. And they wanted him to come down to the station with them. Rezo's pulse raced with nerves. But at this point, he wasn't really surprised. Because by now, he knew that writing Gloomy Sunday had been a horrific, terrible mistake. Because it would turn out, Gloomy Sunday had been a very shockingly impactful song, just as Rezo had thought he wanted it to be. But over the course of the last year, the police had begun finding its sheet music, or its written lyrics, or the actual song playing on record players at the scenes of suicides. Dozens and dozens of people across Hungary, across Europe, and in the United States from police officers to teenagers to waitstaff to students, had taken their own lives, basically while listening to Gloomy Sunday. These deaths became so widespread that a Hungarian archbishop actually wrote a public letter to the people begging them to stop hurting themselves. And multiple official bans of the song itself were enacted across Europe and England and the United States. On the day that the Budapest police knocked on Rezo's door, they demanded that he stop all sales of the song. And Rezo immediately agreed. And eventually, so did the song's publisher and his musical partner, Laszlo. And Rezo's partner, Laszlo, was especially grief-stricken by this whole thing. Because his fiancée, the one who had broken his heart on the very day he had written the song with Rezo, she ended up being one of the many suicide victims. Before she took her own life, she sent Laszlo a telegram which simply said, "Gloomy Sunday." No one knows for sure why Gloomy Sunday potentially caused this sudden wave of death. One theory is that people were already really suffering from depression and feeling hopeless because of the Great Depression and the worsening political climate. And the song's popularity was either a terrible coincidence or it served as a sort of unfortunate trigger for those who were already on the edge. As for Rezo, he was devastated by the dark legacy of his song. Even though it did technically live up to his original vision, it did deeply resonate with people and was unquestionably a hit. It was a nightmare. Over the years, despite all the negative associations with the song, it's been translated into 28 different languages and was even performed by legendary singers like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday. Initially, there was an estimated 20 suicides attributed to Gloomy Sunday across Europe and the United States. In the years that have followed, however, the lore around the song has only grown, and some estimates now put the death toll in the hundreds. Although these numbers are very difficult to verify, Rezo never wrote another hit song. And in fact, ultimately, he followed in the footsteps of some of his listeners. He jumped out of the window of his 8th-floor apartment on another overcast, gloomy Sunday, and he died 2 days later. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Just after midnight on the 22nd of June 1991, a man named Charles Holden was heading home. He had just finished a long shift at work and was feeling that deep, bone-tired exhaustion that only comes after a full day's labor. His house was in a quiet part of Harrington, Delaware, a small town where not much usually happened. Before he pulled into his own driveway, he decided to make one last stop. There was a fast food restaurant nearby, one of those places with bright lights that cut through the late-night darkness, and the thought of a quick bite to eat was too good to pass up. He pulled his truck into the nearly empty parking lot, went inside, ordered his food, and was back in his truck in just a few minutes. He started the engine, the familiar rumble, a comforting sound in the quiet night. He was just about to put the truck in drift, a question head the final few blocks home, when he saw something in his peripheral vision. A figure, a man, was running towards his truck. The man was waving his arms frantically, trying to get Charles's attention, trying to flag him down. Charles hesitated. It was late, after midnight, and this was a complete stranger. Every instinct told him to just drive away. But the man looked desperate. So, against his better judgment, Charles shifted the truck back into park. He rolled down his window just enough to hear what the guy wanted, the cool night air rushing in. The man ran right up to the driver's side window, breathing heavily. He leaned down and explained his situation. He said his sister was in labor right now, having a baby, and he desperately needed a ride to the hospital. The hospital was about a 20-minute drive away, and he had no other way to get there. Charles looked at the man. He tried to read his face to see if he was telling the truth, but it was hard to tell. There was an edge to the man, something that made Charles feel uneasy. His gut was screaming at him that this was a bad idea. And so Charles made what he thought was the sensible decision. He told the man no. He said, "I'm sorry, it's just too late, I have to get home. It's too far out of my way." The stranger's face fell. The desperation was replaced by a look of pure dejection. He didn't argue or plead. He just turned around and started walking away, his shoulders slumped. Charles watched him go. He watched him walk back towards the empty, brightly lit restaurant, a lonely figure in the dark parking lot. And as he watched, a wave of guilt washed over him. What if the guy was telling the truth? What if his sister really was having a baby, and he was the only person who could help? Charles couldn't live with that thought. So, he leaned his head out the window and called out. He said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride. I can't take you all the way, but I'll take you part of the way there." The stranger's face lit up with a huge smile. He ran back to the truck, opened the passenger door without even waiting for Charles to unlock it, and hopped inside. And with that, they took off into the night. The first few minutes of the drive were tense and quiet. Charles focused on the road, acutely aware of the unknown man sitting next to him. The stranger didn't say much, just gave directions. Charles drove for about 3 miles, following the route the man had indicated, heading in the general direction of the hospital. Finally, Charles found a well-lit spot on the side of the road and started to pull over. He turned to the stranger and said, "This is as far as I can take you. My house is only about a block away from here, and I really don't want to get too far from home this late at night." He expected the man to be grateful for the ride, to thank him and get out. But that's not what happened. The moment the truck stopped, the stranger's entire demeanor changed. The smile vanished. His eyes grew cold and angry. He started fumbling inside his jacket pocket, his movements jerky and aggressive. He was clearly reaching for something, and Charles's mind immediately jumped to the worst possible conclusion. He thought the man was going for a knife, or maybe even a gun. Before Charles could even process what was happening, the man started screaming at him. He yelled, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I am going to kill you." The threat hung in the small cab of the truck, heavy and terrifying. All the bad feelings Charles had in the parking lot came rushing back, 10 times stronger. He knew he was in serious trouble. But instead of freezing, his adrenaline kicked into high gear. He reacted on pure instinct. In one swift motion, he turned off the truck's engine, ripped the keys right out of the ignition, and threw his door open. He leaped out of the truck and just started running. He didn't know where he was going, he just knew he had to get away. He glanced up and saw the distant glow of a convenience store sign way down the road. That became his target. He figured if he could just make it there, he could find help, he could call the police. He sprinted down the dark road, his heart pounding in his chest. After a few seconds, he risked a look back over his shoulder, and his blood ran cold. The stranger had also jumped out of the truck and was now running after him. And in his hand, glinting under the sparse streetlights, was a screwdriver. The man was holding it like a dagger. And he was fast. Really fast. Charles was running as hard as he could, but the stranger was gaining on him. The footsteps behind him were getting louder and closer. The convenience store still seemed impossibly far away. And in that moment, Charles realized he wasn't going to make it. There was no way he could outrun this guy. So, he made a split-second, life-or-death decision. He just stopped. He stopped running, turned around, and put his hands up in the air as a sign of surrender. He yelled out, "Okay, okay, okay, I'll give you a ride. You can go wherever you want to go. Then you can have my keys, you can have my wallet, you can have anything you want. Just please, don't hurt me." The stranger was running full tilt, and he skidded to a stop just a few feet in front of Charles. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He was clearly very pleased with this outcome. He had won. He took a step forward and jabbed the screwdriver towards Charles's chest, not hard enough to break the skin, but enough to make a point. He then gestured with the screwdriver back towards the truck. The message was clear. They were going back. So Charles turned and started the long, terrifying walk back to his own vehicle. The stranger stayed right behind him the whole way, so close Charles could feel his breath. Every few steps, the man would poke him in the back with the tip of the screwdriver, a constant, sharp reminder of who was in control. They finally reached the truck. The stranger ordered Charles to get in the driver's seat and wait. Charles did as he was told. He slid behind the wheel, his hands shaking. The stranger walked around to the passenger side, his hand on the door handle, ready to get in and continue his terrifying plan. But as soon as Charles's body hit the seat, another surge of adrenaline hit him. He still had the keys clutched in his hand. He saw a tiny window of opportunity. Without a second thought, he jammed the key into the ignition, fired up the truck's engine, and slammed his foot on the gas. The truck lurched forward and sped off just as the stranger was pulling the passenger door open. Charles was flying down the road, away from the man who had just tried to kill him. He glanced in his rearview mirror. He could see the stranger standing in the middle of the road, absolutely furious. The man started chasing the truck on foot, holding the screwdriver high above his head like he was going to throw it. But after a few seconds, he just stopped, turned around, and walked off into the darkness. Charles was safe. He had escaped. He drove for a few minutes, his mind racing, trying to process what had just happened. He was completely overwhelmed with relief. His first thought was to call the police, to report the attempted carjacking and assault. But then he thought about it more. It was his own decision to let a complete stranger into his truck in the middle of the night. He felt foolish. He felt like he had brought this on himself. And so, he decided not to call the police. He just wanted to go home and forget the whole thing ever happened. But then another, more practical fear started to creep in. The spot where he had ditched the stranger, where he had that terrifying confrontation, it wasn't far from his house at all. He was worried. What if this guy was still in the area? What if he saw Charles's truck turn onto his street? He could recognize it, follow him home, and then who knows what could happen. The man was clearly violent and unpredictable. So, Charles made a new plan. He decided he would just stay out of town for a while. He would drive around on the outskirts, give the stranger plenty of time to get far, far away from his neighborhood. He drove aimlessly for about an hour, the minutes ticking by slowly. He went down empty country roads, through quiet residential streets on the other side of town, anywhere but home. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he decided it was safe. Surely, the man was long gone by now. So he turned his truck around and headed back towards his own street in Harrington. He drove slowly, cautiously, scanning the sidewalks. He turned onto his street, the familiar sight of his neighbors' houses, a welcome relief. And then he saw him. Standing right there, walking down the sidewalk just a few houses down from his own, was the stranger. The same man who had just tried to kill him with a screwdriver was now impossibly on his street. Luckily, the man didn't seem to hear or see Charles's truck pull onto the road. His back was turned. Charles's heart leaped into his throat. He didn't even think. He immediately slammed the truck into reverse and backed out of the street as quickly and quietly as he could. He drove off, his mind reeling. This couldn't be a coincidence. What was this guy doing here? Did he know who Charles was? Was he targeting him? Was he waiting for him to come home? All the fear and paranoia came crashing back. At this point, Charles knew he had no choice. He had to call the police. This was no longer just about a random, botched robbery. This felt personal. This felt dangerous. He found a payphone a few miles away and dialed 911. He told the dispatcher the whole incredible story. He explained the initial encounter, the chase, the escape, and now the shocking discovery of the man lurking around his own property. The dispatcher listened patiently and told him they would send an officer to meet him right away. A few minutes later, a police car pulled up to the payphone. Charles explained everything all over again to the officer. He told him how terrified he was that this man might be waiting for him at his house. The officer listened and then told Charles not to worry. He said he would escort Charles back to his property. And if the stranger was still anywhere in the area, they would find him and they would arrest him. So the two of them, the police car following Charles's truck, made their way back to Charles's house. They pulled onto the street. The stranger was gone. They searched the entire area, the front yard, the backyard, the surrounding streets. There was no sign of him. Charles then went into his house, with the officer right behind him. They checked every room. There was no sign of a break-in, nothing was out of place. It seemed like the danger had passed. Charles felt a profound sense of relief. He thanked the officer profusely for his help. He felt like he could finally breathe again. The officer was about to leave, to get back in his patrol car and head back out on his shift. But just as he was walking out the door, Charles had one last thought. It was almost an afterthought, a final piece of due diligence. He asked the officer if he wouldn't mind doing one more quick sweep. He explained that his mother lived right behind him. Her property was just on the other side of a thick row of bushes that separated their backyards. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived all by herself. Charles just wanted to be absolutely sure that nothing had happened to her, that the stranger hadn't bothered her. It was just a son's instinct, a simple request to make sure his elderly mother was safe. The officer said, of course, no problem at all. He would be happy to go check on her. So, the officer left Charles's house. He walked across Charles's backyard, a perfectly normal patch of grass. He pushed his way through the dense bushes that acted as a natural fence. And he stepped into Dorothy's backyard. And right away, he could see that something was terribly wrong. The back window on Dorothy's back door had been completely smashed. Shards of glass littered the small porch, and the door itself was standing slightly ajar, open just a crack, letting the dark night into the house. The officer's training took over instantly. This was no longer a simple welfare check. This was a potential crime scene. He quietly unholstered his pistol, holding it at the ready. He cautiously approached the open door. He pushed it open further and peered inside. He called out Dorothy's name, his voice echoing in the silent house. There was no answer. The house was totally dark, totally still. The officer entered the house, moving slowly and methodically. He cleared the first floor, room by room. He found nothing. No sign of Dorothy, no sign of an intruder. The silence was unnerving. He then made his way to the flight of stairs that led to the second floor. As he started to climb, his flashlight beam caught something on the floor at the very top of the landing. It was a dark stain. It was blood. A cold dread filled the officer. He followed the trail of blood. It led him down a short hallway and into one of the bedrooms. And there, sprawled out on a bed, he found a woman. It was Dorothy. She had been brutally attacked. She had been stabbed to death. The investigation that followed would uncover one of the most tragic and bizarre coincidences imaginable. It would turn out that after Charles had made his daring escape, leaving the stranger stranded on the side of the road, that stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, was left fuming. His plan to rob Charles had failed, and now he was alone, on foot, in an unfamiliar neighborhood. He started walking, looking for a place to sleep, a place to lie low for the night. He wandered through the quiet streets, looking for an easy target. And then, by pure random horrible chance, he selected a house. He chose the house that just happened to belong to Dorothy, Charles's mother. He broke in through her back door, smashing the window. The noise woke Dorothy up. The 70-year-old woman, hearing an intruder in her home, bravely came down the stairs to confront him. Gilbert Cannon was caught completely by surprise. He panicked. He knew he couldn't leave a witness behind, someone who could see his face and identify him to the police. So, he attacked her. He used the only weapon he had, the same screwdriver he had threatened Charles with just an hour earlier. He stabbed her repeatedly, ensuring she couldn't call for help, ensuring she couldn't identify him. Later, when Gilbert was arrested and interrogated, he would tell the police the entire story. He confirmed that the initial attack on Charles was completely random. He had just been at the fast food restaurant, he saw Charles getting into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. It was a simple, opportunistic crime. And then, after the robbery failed, when he was just looking for a place to hide, he broke into the first house that looked easy. He had no idea who lived there. When the woman, Dorothy, came down the stairs, He attacked her and killed her, never knowing, not for a single second, that this woman was the mother of the very same man he had tried to rob just an hour before. The entire night, from the moment Charles decided to stop for food to the moment the officer discovered Dorothy's body, was one big, horrifying, and unbelievable coincidence. Gilbert Cannon would eventually plead guilty to the murder of Dorothy Holden. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Charles Holden, the aftermath was a life sentence of its own. He had to live with the crushing weight of that night. He had to live with the endless, agonizing questions. What if he had just driven away from the fast food parking lot? What if he had taken the stranger all the way to the hospital? What if he had dropped him off on a different street? It's a chain of events so unlikely, so tragic, it almost defies belief. A reminder that sometimes the most terrible things happen for no reason at all. Some of the scariest stories aren't terrifying because they were carefully planned, they're terrifying because they happened completely by chance. A random ride home. A town pushed past its breaking point. And 2 thieves who vanished without a trace. 3 stories that sound unbelievable, but actually happened. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time. In the early years of the 19th century, a man named John Bell decided that his life in North Carolina had reached a natural limit. It was 1804, and John was a successful, middle-aged farmer who had spent his entire life working the red clay of the South. But John had a big family, and that family was only getting bigger. He and his wife Lucy already had 6 children, and John knew that if he wanted to leave a real legacy for them, he needed more space. He needed land that was rich, vast, and cheap. So, John and Lucy packed up everything they owned. They loaded heavy wooden wagons with their furniture, their farming tools, their clothes, and their food, and they set out on a journey of more than 600 miles. They were heading west, toward a rugged and largely untamed territory in northern Tennessee. Their destination was a place called Robertson County, located right along the winding banks of the Red River. The journey itself was long and incredibly grueling, lasting for weeks as the heavy wagons creaked along muddy trails, through dense forests, and across rough rivers. When the Bell family finally arrived, they found a beautiful but incredibly isolated wilderness. There were only a few other families scattered across the entire county, living miles apart from one another. It was the kind of place where survival depended on hard work, mutual trust, and absolute resilience. But this was exactly the kind of life John Bell had been preparing for his entire life. John was known by everyone who met him as a man of immense physical strength and relentless work ethic. He was a tall, imposing figure, but he possessed a deep, quiet kindness that immediately put people at ease. His wife Lucy was his perfect match. She was a gentle, sweet-tempered woman who believed that no stranger should ever walk away from their home hungry. Back in North Carolina, the Bells had been famous for opening their doors to any traveler who needed a hot meal or a dry place to sleep. If a neighbor fell on hard times, John was always the first to slip some money into their pocket or help them harvest their crops, never asking for anything in return. So, when they settled in Robertson County, John got right to work. He bought a massive 1,000-acre plot of land and began the exhausting process of clearing the dense forest. He chopped down trees for weeks on end, using the heavy timber to construct a beautiful 1.5-story log home for his family. The house sat prominently on a scenic hill overlooking the Red River. This river was a natural gathering spot for the local settlers. Families would travel there to fish, have picnics, and socialize, and because the Bell home was so close to the water, they were constantly greeting neighbors, offering water, and making fast friends. Within just a few years, the Bells had established themselves as one of the most prominent, respected, and beloved families in the entire region. For more than a decade, life on the Bell farm was peaceful and incredibly prosperous. The farm grew into a massive, self-sustaining operation. Every single morning, John would wake up before the sun rose to light the fireplace and wake the children. The kids would get dressed, eat a quick breakfast, and then walk together through the dense woods to reach the local schoolhouse. While the children were away learning, John and his older sons would spend their days out in the fields, planting and harvesting tobacco and corn, raising livestock, and tending to the orchards. They also built flatboats to transport their farm goods down the Red River for trade. John and Lucy even welcomed 3 more children into the world during their time in Tennessee, bringing their family to 9 kids in total. As the years rolled by, the oldest children grew up, got married, and built their own small cabins on the edges of the family property. They were a tight-knit, deeply religious, and happy clan. But then, on a hot, humid summer day in 1817, 13 years after the Bells first arrived in Robertson County, something shifted. It was a normal afternoon, and John was out on his property by himself, inspecting his vast cornfield. The corn was tall, reaching well over his head, and the air was completely still. As John walked between the rows, he suddenly caught a glimpse of something sitting right in the middle of one of the clearings. He stopped and stared. Sitting in the dirt, right between the towering stalks of corn, was a massive dog. Now, in rural Tennessee, seeing a dog running around was not unusual at all. Most farmers had working dogs, and stray animals frequently wandered from property to property. But as John looked closer at this animal, a cold knot began to form in his stomach. There was something deeply, profoundly wrong with this creature. For starters, it was far too large to be any normal domestic dog. It was massive, easily the size of a large timber wolf. But its body looked strangely misshapen, as if its bones had been broken and shattered many times over and had reset at bizarre, unnatural angles. It had a strange, jagged posture, and its fur was a patchy, matted dark gray. But the most unsettling thing about the creature was its face. It was sitting perfectly still, staring directly at John. It did not pant, it did not growl, and it did not wag its tail. It just locked its eyes onto John's eyes. John would later describe the look in that animal's eyes as being completely human. It was a cold, calculating, and knowing stare that felt deeply unnatural. John was not a man who spooked easily. He was a rugged pioneer who had faced wild predators and harsh winters without flinching. But standing there in the silent cornfield under the intense gaze of this misshapen beast, John felt a sudden, inexplicable wave of panic wash over him. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. Hands sliding down to his side, John raised his hunting rifle, which he always carried with him on the farm. He took careful aim at the creature, squeezed the trigger, and fired. The loud crack of the rifle shattered the silence of the afternoon. But the moment the gun went off, the strange animal did not fall. Instead, it leapt into the air and began to run. John stood frozen, watching as the massive, twisted beast galloped with incredible speed away from him, weaving effortlessly through the corn before finally disappearing into the dense tree line of the surrounding forest. Once the creature was completely out of sight, John marched forward to the exact spot where the animal had been sitting. He wanted to see if his shot had connected, or at least see what kind of tracks this massive beast had left behind. But when he reached the clearing, John stopped in absolute confusion. The dirt where the animal had been sitting was completely undisturbed. The surrounding corn stalks were not bent or pushed aside, which should have been impossible for a creature of that size. John dropped to his knees to inspect the ground, searching for paw prints, claw marks, or drops of blood. But there was nothing. No tracks led into the clearing, and no tracks led out toward the forest where John had just watched the animal run. It was as if the creature had simply materialized out of air and then vanished back into it. John sat there for a long time, scratching his head and trying to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Eventually, he decided he was just letting his imagination get the better of him. He told himself it was just a strange, ugly, wild dog, and that his shot had simply missed. He decided to put the entire incident out of his mind, turned around, and walked back to his house, telling no one about what had happened. But the dog in the cornfield was only the beginning. Not long after that strange summer afternoon, the peace of the Bell household was shattered by a new and deeply unsettling phenomenon. It started quietly at first, during the late hours of the night when the entire family was asleep. John and Lucy would be lying in their bed when they would suddenly be awakened by a sharp, rhythmic knocking sound. It sounded like someone was standing right outside their house, rapping their knuckles hard against the heavy logs of the exterior walls. The sound would go tap, 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 and then stop. John, believing that some local teenager was playing a prank on them, would quietly slip out of bed, grab his lantern and his shotgun, and creep toward the front door. He would fling the door open and sprint outside, shining his light into the darkness, fully expecting to catch a laughing neighbor red-handed. But every single time John ran outside, the yard was completely empty. There was no one running away, no sound of rustling leaves, and no laughter. John would walk the entire perimeter of the house, holding his lantern close to the ground, but he never found any footprints in the soft dirt around the foundation. Confused, John would lock the door, get back in bed, and blow out his lantern. But the very second his head hit the pillow and the house went dark, the knocking would start up again. Only this time, it would be coming from the opposite side of the house. It was as if whatever was making the noise was playing a sick game of hide and seek with him, moving effortlessly and silently from wall to wall. John was determined not to give up. He was convinced that someone in the community was trying to scare them, perhaps out of jealousy for the Bell's success and popularity. He gave strict instructions to his wife and children that they were not to mention these noises to anyone. He believed that if the pranksters realized they were getting a reaction, they would keep doing it. But if the Bells ignored it and pretended nothing was happening, the pranksters would eventually get bored and stop. John also wanted to keep it a secret so he could catch them in the act. If the town didn't know the Bells were looking for them, the culprits would get careless. But the plan did not work. Over the next several weeks, the tapping and knocking on the walls grew more frequent and much louder. It was no longer just a gentle tapping. It sounded like heavy wooden beams were being slammed against the sides of the house, shaking the entire structure. John and his older sons spent countless nights lying in wait, hidden in the bushes around the property with their weapons ready, waiting for the noises to start. But whenever they were outside waiting, the house remained completely silent. The moment they gave up and went back inside, the violent pounding would immediately resume. The psychological toll of these sleepless, tense nights began to weigh heavily on the entire family, but they had no idea that the true horror was about to move inside their home. On a Sunday night in May of 1818, about a year after John had seen the strange dog in the cornfield, 4 of John's young sons were asleep in their shared bedroom. The boys slept in 2 wooden bunk beds positioned against the far wall of the room. The 2 oldest brothers, who were teenagers at the time, slept on the lower bunks, while the younger brothers slept above them. Sometime around midnight, the 2 older brothers were suddenly startled awake by a very strange sound. It was a sharp, grating, scraping noise that seemed to be coming from the corner of the room. They lay perfectly still in the dark, straining their ears to identify what they were hearing. As they listened, the sound became more distinct. It sounded exactly like a large rat gnawing furiously on the hard oak wood of one of their bedposts. The boys knew that wild animals sometimes made their way inside log cabins, so they weren't immediately terrified. They just figured a stubborn rodent had gotten inside and was chewing on the furniture. The 2 older brothers quietly swung their legs out of their beds, preparing to grab a broom and chase the animal out. But the absolute second their bare feet touched the cold wooden floorboards, the gnawing sound completely stopped. The room fell into a dead, heavy silence. The boys stood up, lit a candle, and began searching every corner of the bedroom. They looked behind the dressers, they checked the closet, and they got down on their hands and knees to inspect the base of every single bedpost. But, to their complete surprise, there was no rat to be found anywhere. More importantly, when they closely examined the wooden bedposts, there were no teeth marks, no fresh wood shavings, and absolutely no sign that any animal had been chewing on the wood. The posts were completely pristine. Confused and exhausted, the boys figured they must have scared the animal back into a hole in the wall. They blew out the candle, climbed back into their beds, and pulled the covers up to their chins. But the very instant they closed their eyes, the scraping sound returned. This time, it was not just a gentle gnawing. It was incredibly loud, fast, and frantic, sounding as if multiple large creatures were desperately trying to tear their way through the solid wood of the beds right beneath them. The boys leapt out of bed once more, but again, the moment their feet hit the floor, the sound vanished instantly. This torment went on for the entire night, keeping the boys awake and trembling in terror until the morning sun finally filtered through the windows. The next night, the exact same thing happened. The boys tried to ignore the sounds, but the sheer volume and persistence of the gnawing made sleep completely impossible. Then, on the third night, the entity in the room decided to escalate things. As the exhausted boys lay in the dark, the familiar gnawing sound began, but then it abruptly stopped and was replaced by a sound that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. From the darkness, directly underneath their beds, they heard the sound of someone gasping violently for air. It sounded like a human being was lying on the floor beneath them, being choked or suffocated, desperately struggling to draw breath into their lungs. This gasping was accompanied by a wet, heavy gulping sound, followed by the sound of lips smacking together, and then a frantic scratching against the underside of the bedboards, as if someone was clawing at the wood with their fingernails. The two older brothers were absolutely paralyzed with fear. This was clearly not a rat or any other wild animal. It sounded like a dying person was trapped right beneath their mattresses. Finally, unable to take the terror any longer, the boys screamed, threw off their blankets, and fled the room. They woke up John and Lucy, sobbing and shaking as they explained what they had been hearing. John, seeing how genuinely terrified his sons were, realized this was no simple prank. He gathered his older sons, armed them with clubs and lanterns, and they conducted a massive, systematic search of the entire house. They pulled furniture away from the walls, tore up floorboards, searched the crawl spaces, and checked every inch of the attic. But just like before, they found absolutely nothing. There were no animals, no intruders, and no physical evidence that anything had ever been disturbed. By this point, the Bell children were completely terrified to sleep in their own home. They were exhausted, pale, and constantly on edge. John knew that he could no longer keep this a secret. He needed help, and he needed an outside perspective to prove to him that he wasn't losing his mind. So, John walked to the neighboring property of a close and highly trusted friend. He sat down with his neighbor and told him the entire story, from the strange dog in the cornfield to the pounding on the walls and the horrifying sounds in his son's bedroom. John was a man of absolute integrity in Robertson County. He never told tall tales, he didn't drink, and he was known for his cold, hard practicality. Because of this, the neighbor didn't laugh or dismiss John's story. He looked at his friend's exhausted, hollow eyes and said that he would come over that very night to stay in the house and help him investigate. That evening, the neighbor arrived at the Bell home and took up a post in the boys' bedroom. For the first few hours, the house was quiet. But as midnight approached, the air in the room suddenly grew bitterly cold. Then, right on cue, the violent knocking began on the outer walls of the house. The neighbor gasped as the heavy log walls literally vibrated from the force of the blows. Before he could even process the sound, the frantic gnawing noise started on the bedposts, followed immediately by the wet, choking, gasping sounds from directly beneath his chair. The neighbor, a brave and hardened man of the frontier, was so utterly terrified by the sheer hostility and unnatural nature of the sounds that he could not bear to stay in the room. He ran out of the bedroom, grabbed his coat, and fled the Bell house in the middle of the night, refusing to spend another second inside. The next morning, word of what the neighbor had experienced spread like wildfire through Robertson County. The community was shocked. The Bells were the pillars of their town, and the idea that they were being targeted by some unseen malicious force was deeply alarming to everyone. The townspeople, who loved John and Lucy, decided they were not going to let this family suffer alone. They organized a rotation of volunteers, with groups of local men taking turns staying overnight at the Bell home. They hoped that by having a constant, watchful presence of armed men, they could either catch the person responsible or at least provide the family with enough peace of mind to get some sleep. But the presence of the townspeople did nothing to stop the phenomena. In fact, the entity seemed to thrive on the growing audience. Every single night, no matter how many men were guarding the house, the noises occurred. The volunteers tried everything they could think of to find a logical explanation. Some suggested that John's youngest daughter was somehow orchestrating the sounds to get attention, but this theory was quickly disproven when investigators closely watched the girl as she slept, while the loud knocking and gasping sounds continued in a completely different part of the house. Others believed that a rival family had hired a professional ventriloquist to torment the Bells. At the time, ventriloquism was viewed by many rural folks with great suspicion, almost like a form of dark magic, and they thought someone was throwing their voice to make the sounds appear to come from under the beds. But no matter how thoroughly they searched the house and the surrounding woods, they never found any wires, hidden devices, or suspicious people lurking on the property. As the months turned into years, the constant state of terror began to take a devastating, visible toll on John Bell. The once strong, vibrant, and energetic patriarch began to rapidly wither away. His posture became hunched, his skin took on a gray, sickly pallor, and he lost a dramatic amount of weight. But the most alarming change was in his behavior. John had always been an incredibly sharp, attentive man who looked people directly in the eye and spoke with great clarity. But now he began to suffer from bizarre, terrifying physical fits. It would happen during normal, everyday activities. John would be standing in the yard talking to a neighbor about the harvest when suddenly his eyes would completely glaze over. It was as if his mind had suddenly departed his body. His jaw would drop open, hanging completely slack, and his gaze would lock on to some distant, unseen point in the sky. Then his face would begin to violently twitch. At first, these facial spasms were relatively minor, mostly localized around his eyes and temples. But as the weeks went on, the fits grew far more severe and grotesque. His entire face would contort into a mask of pure agony. His jaw would quiver and shake uncontrollably up and down, and his eyelids would begin to blink rapidly out of sync with one another, giving him a deeply disturbing, unhuman appearance. While these fits were happening, John was completely unresponsive. Neighbors and family members would scream his name, wave their hands in front of his face, and shake his shoulders, but John would remain frozen, locked in his silent, twitching trance. When the fit finally passed, John would not offer any explanation. He would not apologize or even acknowledge what had just happened. Instead, he would turn away in silence, slowly walk up the hill to his house, and retreat to his bedroom. There, he would sit on the edge of his bed for hours on end, staring blankly at the wooden wall in complete, stony silence. He refused to eat, he refused to drink, and he would not speak to his terrified wife or children. In the rare moments when John was lucid and spoke to Lucy in private, he wept and confessed that he believed some malicious force was systematically torturing him, slowly draining his life force away, and that it would not stop until he was dead. The family felt completely helpless, trapped in a living nightmare with an invisible enemy that was slowly killing their father. By the autumn of 1820, the torment had been going on for 3 long, agonizing years. The Bells had become social outcasts in many ways, as people were terrified to visit their property, though the community still held a deep sympathy for them. Many locals had come to believe that the source of the haunting was their neighbor, Kate Batts. Kate was a highly eccentric, bitter, and unpleasant woman who had suffered immense tragedy in her life. Her husband was severely disabled, and all 3 of her children had died at a very young age. This immense grief had left her hardened and strange. She had a bizarre habit of trying to sound highly educated by using massive, complex words in everyday conversation, but she almost always used them completely incorrectly, making her talk sound incredibly jarring and off-putting. The townspeople began to whisper that Kate was a witch, and they started calling the entity at the Bell House Kate, believing she had cast a dark curse on the family. Kate, of course, was furious when she heard these rumors and vehemently denied having anything to do with the Bells' misfortune, but the nickname stuck. Then, on a crisp afternoon in October of 1820, one of John's daughters, Esther, had an encounter that would solidify the terror in a way they had never experienced before. Esther had left the main log house to gather eggs from the hen house, which was located directly across the dirt lane that ran past their property. She walked across the lane, enjoying the rare moment of quiet, when she suddenly heard the distinct sound of footsteps shuffling on the dirt road behind her. Esther stopped and turned around. Walking slowly down the lane, heading directly toward the Bell House, was a woman dressed entirely in black. She wore a heavy, dark dress and a large bonnet that completely obscured her face, as her head was bowed low toward the ground. Esther was confused. She hadn't seen anyone else on the road just moments ago, and she wondered how this woman had appeared so suddenly. However, Esther wasn't particularly frightened yet. She assumed it was just a neighbor from the village who had come to visit or was passing through, so she turned back around and walked into the hen house to finish her chores. She spent a few minutes gathering the fresh eggs into her basket, and when she stepped back out onto the lane, she looked down the road to see where the woman had gone. To her surprise, the woman in black was still there, trudging along at an incredibly slow, agonizing pace, now much closer to the entrance of the Bell property. Esther, wanting to be polite, began to walk down the road toward her, keeping a close eye on the figure. As she got closer, Esther realized she didn't recognize the woman's clothing, which looked old-fashioned and completely out of place. Esther called out a loud, cheerful hello, but the woman did not respond. She didn't raise her head, she didn't slow down, and she didn't show any sign that she had heard Esther's voice. Esther walked faster, closing the distance between them until she was only about 15 feet behind the figure. She called out again, asking if she could help her or if she was looking for someone. Still, there was absolute silence from the woman. The road was completely empty, the wind had died down, and the only sound was the crunching of Esther's own footsteps. A sudden, deep sense of unease washed over Esther. The way the woman was moving was incredibly unnatural, almost mechanical. Esther stopped dead in tracks, refusing to get any closer. The moment Esther stopped walking, the woman in black also stopped instantly. She stood perfectly still in the middle of the road, her back still facing Esther. Then, slowly, the woman raised her hands to her head. She untied the strings of her black bonnet and lifted it off, dropping it onto the dirt road. The moment the bonnet fell, a mass of thick, matted, jet-black hair tumbled down her back. Still, without turning around, the woman raised her hands into her hair and began to run her fingers through it as if she was trying to comb out the tangles. Esther watched, frozen in confusion. But then, the woman's hands began to move faster. She wasn't just combing her hair anymore. She was grabbing massive clumps of her own hair and pulling them with immense force. Esther watched in absolute horror as the woman began violently ripping her own hair out of her scalp. Across the silent road, Esther could clearly hear the sickening, wet, ripping sound of hair being torn from flesh. Within seconds, bloody clumps of black hair were scattering all over the dirt road, but the woman's hands only moved faster and faster, her arms blurring as she mutilated herself in complete silence. Overcome with pure terror, Esther realized she had to get away. She didn't dare run past the woman, so she scrambled through the brush, bypassed her entirely, and ran screaming into the front door of her house, slamming and locking it behind her. She found her sister inside and dragged her to the front window, pointing out at the road. The woman was still there, standing in the exact same spot, her hands still buried in her bloody hair. But the moment Esther and her sister made eye contact with her through the glass, the woman froze. She slowly lowered her hands, turned around, and stared directly up at the window. Her face was a pale, hollow mask, and her eyes were empty, dark voids. She stared at the sisters for a long, agonizing moment, and then she turned and began to walk around the side of the house. Esther and her sister shrieked and ran across the house to the side window to see where she was going. They watched as the woman in black climbed effortlessly over their wooden fence, entering the side yard. But as she dropped down on the other side, 3 small children, whom the sisters had not seen before, suddenly appeared out of nowhere, marching in a perfect silent line directly behind her. The woman and the 3 children walked directly into a small grove of peach trees on the property. Then, one by one, the woman and each of the children began to climb up into the branches of the trees. Once they were all positioned high in the branches, they turned their heads in unison to stare directly at the window where the sisters were watching. Then they began to violently rock their bodies back and forth, causing the sturdy trees to bend and sway at terrifying, unnatural angles, thrashing left and right as if caught in a violent hurricane, even though the air outside was completely still. Just then, Esther's husband walked through the front door. Hearing the girls screaming, he ran to the side window. Esther pointed frantically outside, screaming for him to look at the woman and the children in the trees. But her husband looked out and gasped. He could see the trees. Indeed, the heavy peach trees were bending almost to the breaking point, thrashing violently back and forth in the windless afternoon. But he could not see the woman. He could not see the 3 children. To his eyes, the branches were completely empty, moving entirely on their own. Realizing that his wife and sister-in-law were seeing something he couldn't, and fearing for their safety, the husband grabbed his rifle, ran out the back door, and sprinted into the grove of trees. But the moment his feet crossed into the orchard, the trees instantly stopped swaying. The branches went completely still, and there was no sign of the woman, the children, or any footprints in the soft soil beneath the trees. It was as if they had never existed. The terror of that afternoon had barely settled when, a few weeks later, John Bell's condition reached a horrific climax. John and one of his adult sons were out walking near the edge of their property, inspecting the fences. As they walked, John suddenly stopped. He let out a choked gasp and threw his hands up in front of his face, as if he was trying to shield himself from an invisible attacker who was raining blows down upon him. John's son watched in horror as his father's body began to violently contort. John's limbs bent at bizarre, painful angles, and his spine began to arch backward with such force that his son could hear the sickening pop of his joints. It looked as though some invisible, immensely powerful force had grabbed John by the head and feet and was trying to bend him in half backward. John's son ran forward, desperate to save his father, and grabbed him around the waist, trying to pull his body straight. But the moment he touched his father, a blood-curdling, deafening shriek erupted from the air all around them. It was a high-pitched, mocking scream that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath their feet, yet there was no one else in sight. The shriek was so incredibly loud and filled with such pure, unadulterated malice that the son was completely paralyzed, his ears ringing as he held on to his convulsing father. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shriek cut off. The air went completely still and silent. John's body went limp, and he collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath as his son held him. John looked up at his son, tears streaming down his weathered, pale face, and whispered that his time had run out. He knew he was going to die. His son helped him to his feet, and the two of them walked back to the house in a heavy, grief-stricken silence. John went straight to his bedroom, climbed into his bed, and did not get up again. On the morning of the 19th of December, 1820, the Bell family gathered in the kitchen for breakfast, but John did not come down. This was highly unusual, as even in his sickness, John always tried to make an appearance. Sensing that something was terribly wrong, Lucy and her sons ran up the stairs to John's bedroom. They found John lying in his bed, still breathing, but his face was incredibly pale and his skin was cold to the touch. Lucy shook his shoulder and called his name, but John was completely unresponsive. He was in a deep, comatose state, and no matter what they did, they could not wake him. One of John's sons, panicking, ran downstairs to the family's medicine cabinet to grab the liquid medicine that the doctor had prescribed to help with John's fits. But when he opened the cabinet door, he stopped in shock. The glass bottle containing his father's regular medicine was completely gone. In its place sat a small, strange glass vial that none of them had ever seen before. The vial was filled with a thick, smoky, dark-colored liquid. The son grabbed the vial and ran back upstairs, showing it to the rest of the family, but no one had any idea where it had come from or what was inside it. They immediately sent a rider to fetch the local doctor. When the doctor arrived at the Bell home, he rushed up to the bedroom and examined John. He confirmed that John was in a deep coma and that his body was rapidly failing. The son then handed the doctor the mysterious vial of dark liquid and explained that it had replaced John's medicine. The doctor uncorked the vial and sniffed it, but he could not identify the substance. He knew it was highly suspicious, so he turned to the family and said they needed to test the liquid immediately to see if it was toxic. One of the sons went outside, found a stray cat that had been wandering around the barn, and brought it inside. Using a small dropper, the doctor carefully forced a few drops of the smoky dark liquid down the cat's throat. The reaction was almost instantaneous. Within less than a minute, the cat began to violently twitch, its body contorting in the exact same horrifying angles that John's body had experienced in the woods. The cat let out a quiet mew, collapsed onto the floor, and died right in front of them. The doctor looked at the family in horror. The liquid was a highly concentrated, lethal poison. But how had it gotten into the locked medicine cabinet, and who had replaced John's medicine with it? There was no time to answer these questions, because the next morning, the 20th of December 1820, John Bell took his final, shallow breath and died. For decades, the story of John Bell's death was told as a classic tale of a supernatural haunting, with many believing that the Bell Witch herself had physically placed the poison in the cabinet and forced John to drink it. But when you look at the cold, hard facts of the case from a modern investigative perspective, a much more grounded and terrifying reality begins to emerge. This was not the work of a ghost or a witch. This was a highly calculated, cold-blooded, and systematic murder. If we reconstruct the events leading up to John Bell's death, we can see all the classic signs of chronic poisoning. In the early 19th century, heavy metal poisons like arsenic were incredibly common and virtually impossible to detect. Arsenic was odorless, tasteless, and could easily be mixed into food, water, or medicine without the victim ever realizing it. When administered in small, frequent doses over a long period of time, arsenic causes severe neurological damage. The symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning are incredibly distinct. They include sudden dazes, confusion, extreme physical weakness, muscle wasting, and, most importantly, severe motor dysfunction, including violent facial twitching, jaw spasms, and involuntary muscle contortions. This matches the exact physical progression of John Bell's illness over those 3 years. Someone inside the Bell household, or someone with constant, easy access to the home, was slowly and systematically feeding John Bell small doses of poison. This explains why the haunting was so heavily focused on John Bell himself. While the rest of the family experienced frightening noises, John was the only one who suffered from the physical, debilitating fits. The person responsible for this was a master manipulator. They used the town's growing belief in the supernatural and the legend of Kate Batts to create a perfect cover story. Every time the family heard knocking or scraping or gasping, it was likely staged by the killer to reinforce the idea that the house was cursed by a demon or a witch. By creating a chaotic, terrifying atmosphere of paranormal dread, the killer ensured that when John's health began to fail, the family and the townspeople would immediately blame the witch, rather than suspecting that someone was slipping poison into his tea or his medicine. The climax of this plan occurred on the night of December 18. The killer knew that John was already weak and near death from the years of chronic poisoning. To finish the job, they stole John's actual medicine, which might have helped alleviate some of his symptoms, and replaced it with a massive, lethal dose of the toxic smoky liquid. They knew that in the panic of the morning, someone would likely administer the medicine to John, or perhaps they had already forced John to drink it the night before while he was half conscious. When the family found the vial, the killer's work was already done. The cat dying from just a few drops proved that the liquid was a fast-acting, deadly poison. But in 1820, forensic science was practically non-existent. There were no autopsies, no toxicology reports, and no way to scientifically prove what had killed John Bell. The local authorities, terrified by the supernatural stories and overwhelmed by the grief of the community, simply ruled John's death as being caused by the witch. The killer had committed the perfect crime, using a ghost story to cover up a cold-blooded murder. After John Bell's funeral, a strange and heavy silence fell over the property. The violent knockings, the scratching under the beds, and the terrifying apparitions of the woman in black almost completely disappeared. It was as if the entity had achieved its sole purpose with the death of the family patriarch. Some neighbors reported seeing strange, faint lights floating around the woods near the house at night, and occasionally, people walking near the property would hear a faint, mocking, sing-song voice echoing through the trees. But the physical torment of the family was over. John's wife, Lucy, lived in the log house for another 18 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, until she passed away in 1838. Eventually, the old log house fell into disrepair and was torn down, and today there is nothing left of the original structure. However, on the property, there is a large natural limestone cave known as the Bell Witch Cave. Over the years, countless visitors and paranormal investigators have traveled to the cave, claiming to hear whispers, feel sudden drops in temperature, and experience a deep, lingering sense of dread. Hundreds of grieving neighbors attended John's funeral, and as they stood around his grave, many claimed they heard low, mocking laughter drifting on the wind. This haunting legacy followed the children for the rest of their lives. But the true tragedy of the Bell family lies not in the supernatural, but in the devastating loss of a kind, generous man who built a life from nothing, only to be systematically tortured and murdered in his own home, while his terrified family watched, completely helpless to stop it. The identity of the real killer, the person who stood in that kitchen and replaced the medicine with a vial of poison, remains one of the oldest, coldest, unsolved mysteries in American history. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. On the morning of Sunday, the 17th of June, 2018, a 35-year-old man named Tristan woke up early. The first thing he did was grab his phone to check the weather forecast for Orange County, California. Orange County is a sprawling, beautiful suburb nestled between the massive cities of Los Angeles and San Diego. It was here that Tristan, his 36-year-old wife, Erica Wu, and their two little girls, who were just 2 and 4 years old, had built their life. And on this particular morning, which just so happened to be Father's Day, Tristan was hoping for good news. He had a plan. He wanted to take his whole family out for a perfect day at the beach to celebrate. He watched as the weather app loaded on his phone, and a smile spread across his face. The forecast was for clear skies and sunshine all day. But honestly, even if the app had predicted rain and cold, Tristan probably would have tried to convince everyone to go to the beach anyway. For Tristan, being outdoors was his happy place. It didn't matter if it was hiking in the mountains, camping under the stars, or just tossing a frisbee in a park. If he was outside, he was content. This love for nature was something he had already passed down to his 2 young daughters. They were his little adventure sidekicks, always eager to explore the world with their dad. It made Tristan incredibly happy to see them falling in love with the same things he did. His wife Erica, she enjoyed the outdoors too, but maybe not with the same level of passion as Tristan. But that was perfectly fine with him. Tristan was the kind of person who just went with the flow. He would make small adjustments to make sure she was comfortable. For instance, whenever they went camping, he was happy to rough it in a tent on the hard ground. But he would always pack a big, full-sized inflatable mattress just for Erica. And it wasn't just about the mattress. It was about his entire personality. Erica adored him for it. He was just so easygoing and accepting of people as they were. He never judged anyone. He was just at peace with the world. In fact, that exact quality was what first drew Erica to him all those years ago. They had met back in high school. Some mutual friends had set them up because Tristan needed a date for a school dance. Erica agreed to go with him, and the night of the dance was the first time she ever laid eyes on him. And he was quite a sight. Over the summer, he had shot up a few inches in height, but hadn't quite filled out yet, so he was tall and very lanky. And for this dance, he was completely overdressed in a full tuxedo, but he wasn't self-conscious about it at all. He was just genuinely excited to be there with a date. And all night long, Tristan owned that tuxedo, dancing with all his lanky, gangly glory as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He made it his mission to make sure Erica had a great time, and she absolutely did. After that night, the two of them were pretty much inseparable. Their lives took them on impressive paths. Erica went on to study at Stanford University and became a successful OBGYN doctor. Tristan became a brilliant and widely published scientist. He even held a patent related to vaccine delivery. On paper, his resume was unbelievable, stacked with achievements, but all that success never changed the core of who Tristan was. His colleagues at the lab, who all loved him, found it hilarious. Here was this genius chemist working on cutting-edge cancer treatments, a guy doing incredibly complex research, who was also this laid-back person who walked around the lab starting most of his sentences with the word dude. By early afternoon on that Father's Day, the Bodette family had made their way to a local beach. Erica settled into a beach chair with a book, while Tristan and the two little girls set up a sunshade right at the edge of the water. They started digging in the sand, building little castles. Every so often, Erica would look up from her book and watch them. She'd see them laughing as they dug. Then they'd suddenly abandon their project and run into the shallow surf, shrieking with delight as they tried to outrun these small, gentle waves that crashed around their ankles. At one point, Erica looked up and saw her daughters having the time of their lives, and then she saw Tristan look over at her. He flashed her this huge, happy grin. And in that one single moment, watching her family, Erica felt a sense of pure contentment wash over her. It was a feeling that didn't always come easily to her. Unlike Tristan, who could just relax and enjoy life as it came, Erica was a constant worrier. This anxiety traced all the way back to when she was just 8 years old. That was the year she lost her father. It was a deeply traumatic event that had devastated her family and cast a long shadow over her childhood. Ever since then, she had lived with a persistent, quiet fear that no matter how good things were, something terrible was always just around the corner, waiting to ruin it all. But sitting there on the beach, seeing that smile on her husband's face, and hearing the laughter of her children, that fear melted away. It was a perfect moment. So Erica put her book down, got up from her chair, and ran to join her family in the water. She had no way of knowing that her deepest fear was about to become a reality. 4 days later, on Thursday, June 21st, the atmosphere at their home was very different. Erica was trying to study for a huge medical exam she was scheduled to take the very next day. But with Tristan and their 2 energetic daughters at home, the house was loud and chaotic. It was impossible for her to focus. Tristan could see the stress on her face. He also knew that on top of the exam, they were only a week away from a massive life change. They were moving to San Francisco. They had already put a deposit down on a new house up there, closer to some of their family. It was a good move for them, but it added another huge layer of pressure. Looking at his wife, Tristan knew she needed a break. She needed some peace and quiet to study and prepare. And so, he came up with a plan. He decided he would take the girls and get out of the house for the weekend. He made a couple of quick phone calls. A little while later, he went to Erica and told her what he had arranged. He had booked a campsite up in Malibu, California. Malibu is another one of those iconic Southern California towns about an hour-and-a-half drive north of Orange County. It's known for being a wealthy enclave where celebrities live, and he told her that he had also called his brother-in-law, Scott, who had 2 young sons of his own, ages 3 and 5. The plan was for all of them to go camping together for the weekend. Erica was incredibly grateful. She really did need the time and space to study. But at the same time, a familiar sense of worry started to creep in. Tristan often took the girls on little adventures, but he had never taken them camping overnight by himself without her there. Her first instinct was to object, to say it wasn't a good idea. But Tristan, who knew his wife so well, reassured her. He told her not to worry. He promised he would take great care of the kids. He explained that it was a very public, well-known campground with lots of other people around. He promised it was totally safe. Eventually, Erica was convinced. So Tristan started packing up the car. He loaded in all the camping gear, the kids' toys, and their little bikes. As he worked, the girls were buzzing with excitement about their big camping trip. But Erica couldn't shake a bad feeling. A part of her was silently hoping that something would happen and they would have to cancel the trip. She just felt like something bad was about to happen. But nothing happened to stop them. After the car was all packed and the girls were buckled into their car seats, Tristan came over to Erica. He gave her a kiss goodbye and told her he'd see her in a couple of days. He wished her good luck on her test. And with that, he got into the driver's seat, backed out of the driveway, and headed up the road towards Malibu. Erica stood and watched until the car disappeared from sight. That night, Erica studied late into the evening before finally going to bed. The next morning, she woke up early. She was feeling anxious about the test, and she was still worried about Tristan and the girls. As she was getting ready for her day, she heard a loud, insistent knock on her front door. She glanced at the clock. It was only 6:45 inches the morning. It made no sense. No one should be knocking on her door at this hour. Maybe it was Tristan, but if it were him, he would have just used his key. Apprehensively, she walked to the front of the house and opened the door. The moment she saw who was standing on her porch, she knew. She knew something was terribly, terribly wrong. Erica would later look back on that moment opening the door. And even though it was irrational, she would sometimes think to herself, what if I had just never opened the door? Would this nightmare still have happened? But she did open the door, and standing there was her sister-in-law, Priscilla. Priscilla lived an hour and a half away and was completely unannounced. Her face was frantic and tear-streaked. And then Priscilla gave Erica the most heartbreaking news a person could ever receive. The words were so shocking, so world-shattering, that Erica's mind literally could not process them. She kept thinking, this can't be true. There has to be a mistake. But there was no mistake. Erica would not be taking her medical exam that day. Instead, she got into the car with Priscilla, and they began the long, silent drive to Malibu. The day before, Tristan and his two little girls had arrived at the entrance to Malibu Creek State Park. When you think of Malibu, you probably picture mansions on the beach. But just inland from the coast, the landscape changes dramatically. It becomes rugged and wild, full of deep canyons and dense forests. And nestled right in the middle of all this wilderness is the state park. Tristan and his brother-in-law Scott pulled up to the gate, checked in with the park rangers, and were given directions to their campsites. They had reserved 2 spots right next to each other. A campsite in a place like this is usually just a simple, square plot of dirt, maybe with a fire pit. It's just enough space to pitch a tent. So Tristan and Scott drove across the campground to their assigned spots. But as soon as they got there, Tristan realized the spots weren't very good. They were located right next to the portable toilets, so there was a bit of a smell, and a lot of people were walking back and forth. The ground was also on a slight slope, which would make sleeping uncomfortable. It just wasn't ideal. Scott agreed, so he decided to go back and talk to the rangers to see if they could move. He drove back to the entrance, spoke with a ranger, and it turned out to be no problem at all. The ranger told him there were 2 other open sites on the far side of the park, and they could just swap their reservation. So Tristan and Scott packed everything back up and drove over to the new spots. And these ones were perfect. They were tucked away at the base of a huge sloping canyon wall, far from any bathrooms or foot traffic. It felt private and secluded, and the ground was perfectly flat. The 2 men were thrilled. They started unloading their cars and setting up their tents, while the 4 kids ran around playing and riding their small bikes. Once the tents were up, they built a fire in the fire pit, which was situated right between the 2 campsites. Scott would be sleeping in his tent with his 2 sons, and Tristan would be in his tent with his 2 daughters. As the sun went down, they all gathered around the fire. They roasted hot dogs and made s'mores, that classic camping treat of marshmallows, chocolate, so graham crackers. The dads told funny jokes and some not too spooky stories. Before long, all 4 kids were completely exhausted. So Scott and Tristan each took their own children and tucked them into their sleeping bags inside the tents. After the kids were settled, the 2 men came back out to the fire. Tristan had brought some pre-made cocktails, and he shared one with Scott. They sat there for a while, just enjoying the quiet of the night and each other's company. Tristan talked a lot about the upcoming move to San Francisco, and Scott was happy to just sit and listen. Eventually, they were both tired too. They decided it was time to call it a night. They carefully put out the fire. Scott gave Tristan a hug and told him he loved him. Then the 2 men went to their separate tents. As Scott climbed into his tent with his sleeping sons, he looked across the now dark fire pit towards Tristan's tent. He could just make out the silhouette of Tristan climbing inside with his girls. After seeing that, Scott zipped up his own tent, lay down, and within about 15 minutes, he was fast asleep. Just before sunrise the next morning, around 4:45 a.m., Scott suddenly woke up. He thought he had heard a loud noise, but he was groggy and couldn't quite place what it was. He lay there in the dark, listening. And as he got his bearings, he realized that one of Tristan's daughters was crying in the other tent. Now, this wasn't immediately alarming. Kids cry. He figured Tristan would comfort her in a minute, and she would go back to sleep. But the crying didn't stop. It just continued. Scott knew that Tristan was a notoriously heavy sleeper, so he started to think, okay, maybe he just hasn't woken up yet. That must be why he's not calming his daughter down. So Scott carefully got out of his sleeping bag, trying not to wake his own sons. He unzipped his tent and stepped outside. The air was cold, and it was still dark. He couldn't see anything inside of Tristan's tent. He walked over to it, and by the time he got there, he could hear Tristan's daughter still crying, clear as day. Scott called out in a loud whisper, "Hey, Tristan. Tristan, wake up!" But there was no response. Nothing. With the little girl still crying just on the other side of the thin nylon wall, Scott decided he had to look inside. He walked around to the front of the tent, found the zipper, and pulled it open. He peered inside, but it was too dark to see clearly. But even in the dim pre-dawn light, he could make out the shapes. He could see Tristan lying still in the middle of the tent. On either side of him were his two daughters. It looked like the 2-year-old was the one who was crying, and the 4-year-old was awake too, whimpering and trying her best to comfort her little sister. As Scott was trying to figure out what was going on, the 2 little girls turned and looked up at him. When they saw him, they both started saying the same word, over and over. Wet. 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 Scott had no idea what they meant. He was starting to feel a surge of panic. He knew something was very wrong. He reached into the tent and started shaking Tristan's shoulder, saying, "Hey, wake up," but the second he touched him, he knew. He knew instantly. Tristan wasn't sleeping. Tristan was dead. And his 2 little girls were sitting right next to him in a pool of his blood. Just before Scott had woken up, someone, somewhere nearby in the darkness of the park, had fired a gun. One of the bullets from that gun had traveled through the night, pierced the thin wall of Tristan's tent, and had struck him directly in the head as he slept peacefully between his 2 daughters. About 2 hours after that, Priscilla arrived on Erica's doorstep to tell her what had happened. To tell her that her husband was gone and that her 2 little girls were now going to grow up without a father, just like she did. The news didn't just break Erica's heart, it completely shattered her world. A 42-year-old man named Anthony Rauda was eventually arrested and charged with Tristan's murder. Rauda had a long and violent criminal history, and at the time of the shooting, he was living illegally off the grid deep in the canyons of that very same park. When police finally caught up to him, he was in possession of a rifle. And ballistics tests later confirmed that it was the same rifle that had fired the bullet that killed Tristan. His trial has been a long and difficult process. It's been repeatedly delayed because Rauda keeps firing his defense attorneys. Although he insists that he is innocent, his behavior in court has done nothing to help his case. He has been so violent and erratic during his court appearances that he has to be strapped into a special chair by his wrists and legs. They even have to put a device called a spit hood over his head to stop him from spitting at or biting people. Assuming that he was the shooter, which the evidence strongly suggests he was, the motive appears to be completely random. It's believed he didn't know Tristan at all. He just, for whatever reason, fired his gun that night. Maybe he was firing recklessly into the darkness, or maybe he intentionally aimed at the tent. We don't know for sure. But either way, one of his bullets found its target, and Tristan Beaudet was killed simply because he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And if the story wasn't already tragic enough, one more detail emerged that made it even more distressing. Tristan's death was not the first shooting to happen in or around Malibu Creek State Park. In the year leading up to his murder, there had been an astounding 6 other shootings in the immediate area. And 2 of those shootings happened inside the very same campground where Tristan was killed. None of those other shootings had been fatal, but in all 6 cases, the person or people responsible were never caught. And it seemed the local police hadn't put much effort into investigating them. It wasn't until a father was killed in his tent next to his children that the stories of all these other unsolved shootings finally came to light. People started looking at a map and connecting the dots. They realized there was a pattern. There was a rogue shooter who had been active in that exact area for a year, and the public had never been warned. The campground was never closed. No one was told that there was a potential danger lurking in the wilderness there. And the big question everyone had was, why? We may get answers to those questions during Anthony Rauda's trial, where he's being charged not only with Tristan's murder, but for all those other shootings as well. In the meantime, Erica has filed a $90 million lawsuit against several government agencies. Her lawsuit argues that her husband had no idea about the threat that existed in that park. If the authorities had just put up a single sign, a single warning to the public, Tristan, being the protective father he was, would have never ever taken his children there. And he would still be alive today. That lawsuit is still ongoing. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Some stories do not begin with violence. They start with silence. With a moment so ordinary that it was almost nothing to worry about. Until you realize what that silence really means. Tonight, we will watch 3 true stories where reality slowly unravels in ways that are almost inexplicable. Each story begins in a familiar world and then gradually drifts away from it, step by step, until what remains feels completely unrecognizable. And in each case, there are films and recordings that have truly turned these events into things that people will never forget. Our first story begins in Ukraine with a little girl named Oksana Malaya. She was born on November 4th, 1983. Her early life was not an easy one. Her parents were extremely poor, and they both struggled with severe alcoholism. Their home was a place of neglect, not a place of warmth and safety. And in the winter of 1986, this neglect would change Oksana's life forever. She was only 3 years old at the time. One freezing night, her parents, lost in a drunken haze, completely forgot about their daughter. They left her outside in the bitter cold of a Ukrainian winter and locked the door. A 3-year-old child, alone in the freezing darkness, has very few options. All she knew was that she was cold and she needed to find warmth to survive. Instinct took over. She crawled towards the only source of warmth she could find, which was the family's dog kennel in the yard. Inside, a number of dogs were huddled together, sleeping. Incredibly, as this tiny human child crawled into their space, the dogs didn't attack her or chase her away. Instead, they seemed to accept her. They let her snuggle in with them, sharing their body heat, and in that moment, they saved her life. But this act of kindness from the dogs would set Oksana on a path that no one could have ever predicted. The next morning, Oksana didn't go back into the house. And her parents, still consumed by their addiction, didn't seem to notice that she was gone. 1 day turned into 2, and 2 days turned into a week. A week turned into a month, and then a year. For the next 5 years, Oksana Malaya lived in that kennel with her family of dogs. From the critical developmental ages of 3 to 8, she had almost no contact with other human beings. Her entire world was the pack. She learned from them. She mirrored them. It was a matter of survival. Slowly, she stopped walking on 2 legs. It was easier and more natural to move on all 4s, just like her canine family. She forgot the few human words she knew and began to communicate through barks, growls, and whimpers. She ate what they ate, which was often raw meat and scraps. Her human identity faded away, replaced by the identity of a dog. In her own mind, that's what she was. She was a member of the pack. This went on until the early 1990s. One day, a person walking near the property saw something that made them stop in their tracks. They saw a small figure running around in the woods behind the house, on all 4s, barking. They couldn't believe their eyes. Confused and concerned, they called the police. When the officers arrived, Oksana's dog family immediately sprang into action. They ran out, surrounding her, barking aggressively at the strange men, protecting one of their own. And Oksana, terrified, started barking ferociously right alongside them. She didn't want these humans to take her. Eventually, the police had to use pieces of meat to lure the other dogs away. Only then were they able to get close enough to retrieve the frightened little girl. When Oksana was taken into custody, the doctors who examined her were stunned. She had physically forgotten how to walk like a human. She couldn't speak a single word. They were deeply concerned. The years from 3 to 8 are absolutely crucial for language development. They feared that because she had missed that window, she might never be able to learn to speak at all. Oksana was placed in an orphanage where a long and difficult journey began. She had to relearn the most basic human behaviors. Slowly, painstakingly, she learned how to stand and walk on 2 legs again. And amazingly, against all odds, she did learn how to speak. But even with these incredible achievements, the 5 years she spent as a dog had left a permanent mark. Although she could form words and sentences, her speech was always flat and monotone. There was no rhythm, no intonation, no emotion in her voice. It made her very difficult to understand and connect with. A psychologist assessed her and concluded that despite being a young adult by this time, Oksana's mental capacity was only that of a 6-year-old. She tried her best to reintegrate into society. By the time she was 22, she even had a boyfriend. He didn't know much about her unique and traumatic past. One day, she decided to show him a part of who she was. She showed him how easily she could still run around and bark just like a dog. It was a part of her history. But the sight apparently terrified him. He broke up with her shortly after and never saw her again. Today, Oksana lives on a farm where she takes care of animals. It's a quiet life, and perhaps it's where she feels most comfortable. She was recently interviewed on a Ukrainian talk show, and she said she no longer wants to live or act like a dog. She said, more than anything, she just wants to be a normal person. Now we move to our second story, which takes us to England in 2008. This case involves identical twin sisters, Ursula and Sabina Eriksson. The two were 41 years old and originally from Sweden. After being apart for many years, they had finally reunited on May 15, 2008. Within just 24 hours of seeing each other again, they decided to take a trip together. They boarded a ferry and headed for Liverpool, England. They arrived in Liverpool at 8:30 in the morning on Saturday, May 17th. Their very first stop was not a hotel or a tourist attraction, but the St. Anne's police station. Once inside, Sabina told the officers that she was extremely concerned for the safety of her children who were back home in Ireland. The police took her seriously. They told her they would follow up, and they did. They contacted the police department in Dublin, who sent officers to Sabina's home. They checked on the children and found that everything was perfectly fine. There was no danger at all. So, with that seemingly resolved, Ursula and Sabina left the police station on foot. They made their way to a bus stop, and at around 11:30 in the morning, they boarded a bus that was headed for London. As the bus started its journey, the driver noticed the sisters were still holding on to all of their luggage. He politely asked them to put their bags in the luggage hold underneath the bus, which was standard procedure. But the women aggressively refused. They started clutching their bags tightly to their chests as if they were protecting something precious. Their behavior made the driver incredibly uncomfortable. He didn't know what was in their bags, and their intense reaction was a major red flag. He decided he didn't want them on his bus. He pulled over at the next service station just outside the city and told the two sisters they had to get off. After they got off the bus, the driver called the police. He told them there was something very strange going on with these two women and that they might want to come and check them out. As it happened, a police officer was already at that service station. He walked over to the sisters and started talking to them. After a brief conversation, the officer decided they weren't a threat to anyone. He figured it was all just a misunderstanding, so he let them go. The officer left, and the bus was long gone. So Ursula and Sabina, now stranded at a service station, started walking. But they didn't walk along the local roads. They started walking down the median of the M6, one of the busiest motorways in the country. A short time later, a highway security camera captured what happened next. The footage shows the two women walking down the central reservation with cars and trucks speeding past them on both sides. At one point, they try to run across the active lanes of traffic. It's clear from the video that it's an impossible and incredibly dangerous thing to do. And sure enough, Sabina gets hit by a car. Thankfully, she was only grazed by the vehicle, so she wasn't seriously injured. She and her sister went back to the median. But several motorists had seen what happened and had called the police. By sheer coincidence, the patrol car that responded to the call was being followed by a film crew. They were shooting for a British television show called Traffic Cops. So when the police arrived on the scene, the cameras were rolling, capturing every moment. The officers managed to get the sisters off the median and over to the relative safety of the shoulder. They started talking to them, trying to understand what was going on. On camera, everything seems to de-escalate. The women appear calm. It looks like they were just two people who were stranded and making some very poor decisions. Then, without any warning, everything changed. Ursula suddenly turned away from the officers and made a dead sprint back into traffic. Cars were whizzing by at high speed. One of the officers lunged and managed to grab the sleeve of her jacket, but she wriggled out of it. She launched herself directly into the path of a massive truck that was traveling at nearly 60 miles an hour. The impact was horrific, and she was thrown down the road. Everyone stood there in shock. And then, just a second later, Sabina started screaming. She yelled, "They're going to steal your organs!" And then she too leaped into traffic. She was immediately hit by another car. The police ran into the road, stopping all traffic. They rushed over to Ursula, the first sister who was hit. They could see that her legs were completely shattered, but somehow she was still alive. As for Sabina, she was unconscious. They didn't know if she was going to make it. When the paramedics arrived, things got even stranger. Ursula, despite her catastrophic injuries, started fighting to sit up. The paramedics were trying to keep her still, telling her that her legs were broken and she was lucky to be alive. But she wouldn't listen. She fought them violently, spitting at the paramedics and the police, and screaming obscenities as if they were the ones trying to hurt her. At the same time, Sabina regained consciousness. The police and paramedics were trying to keep her lying on the ground, but she began fighting her way up. She pushed the officers off of her, managed to get to her feet, and squared off with one of the female police officers. Then she punched the officer directly in the face before turning and running down the motorway. Several officers had to chase after her. They finally surrounded her as she stood with her fists up, ready to fight them all. They had to tackle her to the ground and put her in handcuffs just to stop her from hurting herself or anyone else. Both sisters were taken to the hospital. And as soon as they got there, they both appeared to be acting completely normal again, as if nothing had happened. Ursula was admitted due to her broken legs. She remained calm and cooperative throughout her recovery and was eventually released. No charges were ever pressed against her. Sabina was checked out by doctors, and miraculously, she had no serious injuries. She was released from the hospital and taken to the police station, where she was charged for assaulting the police officer. The very next day, Sabina pleaded guilty to the charges. She was sentenced to just 1 day in custody, which she had already served while waiting for her court appearance. So, she was released. She walked out of the police station a free woman. Later that night, she was walking down a street when she saw two men walking towards her. Their names were Glenn Hollinshead and his friend Peter. She stopped them and asked if they knew of any good bed and breakfasts nearby. Glenn told her that, as a matter of fact, he owned one and she was welcome to stay at his place. Initially, Sabina seemed hesitant, maybe like she thought it was a trap. But she eventually agreed, and the three of them went back to Glenn's house. Once they were inside, Glenn and Peter noticed that Sabina was acting very paranoid. She was constantly looking out of all the windows as if she was expecting someone to come for her. At one point, she offered both men a cigarette. They accepted, but just as she was about to light them, she suddenly snatched the cigarettes out of their mouths. She said, "These might be poisoned," and threw them in the trash. Just before midnight, Peter left, and Glenn and Sabina went to their separate rooms to sleep. The next day, Glenn got up to make some tea and food for Sabina. He realized he was out of tea bags, so he stepped outside and called over to his neighbor, Frank. He asked if he could borrow a few. Frank gave him the tea bags, and Glenn went back inside. About a minute later, Frank saw Glenn stagger back out of his house. He was clutching his stomach and screaming, "She stabbed me!" Frank said his neighbor's last words were, "Frank, take care of my dog," and then he collapsed and died. Frank immediately called the police. Sabina fled from the house and started running. She made her way to a nearby highway and was seen running along the side of the road. A motorist named Josh saw her, and he noticed she was holding a hammer. As she ran, she was repeatedly hitting herself in the head with it. Josh drove past her, pulled over, and got out of his car to try to intercept her. But as she ran towards him, she pulled a roof tile out of her pocket and threw it, hitting Josh in the head. She ran right past him and made it to a bridge that overlooked another road below. Without hesitating, she leaped off. It was a 40-foot drop. When she hit the ground, she broke both of her ankles and fractured her skull. But again, she survived. Police and paramedics were called, and Sabina was taken back to the hospital. And just like before, once she was there, she was reportedly acting totally normal again. Sabina was arrested for the murder of Glenn Hollinshead. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter, but she offered absolutely no explanation for why any of it happened. It was as if she was a completely different person from the one who had committed these violent acts. Her defense team argued that she was suffering from a rare psychiatric condition known as folie à deux, which is a French term that means madness of two. It's a shared psychosis that can sometimes present in identical twins, where one twin has a psychotic break and they somehow transmit their delusion or their insanity to the other twin. The defense claimed Ursula had the initial break, and Sabina was caught in the echo of her madness. Amazingly, the prosecution accepted this claim. Sabina was sentenced to only 5 years in prison. She served her sentence, was released in 2011, and to this day, she is a free woman. Our final story tonight is about a young woman named Lauren Giddings. In June of 2011, Lauren was a law student on the verge of achieving her dream. She was just one final exam away from graduating and becoming a public defender. She was smart, dedicated, and well-liked by everyone who knew her. Despite the intense pressure of her upcoming exam, she had taken the first week of June off to go to her sister's wedding, where she was the maid of honor. Right before she left the wedding to head back to school, she joked with her family. She told them she was going to be locking herself in the library, studying 24/7, and that they shouldn't bother trying to get in touch with her. When she got back to her apartment complex near campus, however, things didn't go as planned. Her classmates, the ones she usually studied with, didn't see her at the library. In fact, no one saw her at all. After a couple of days went by with no sign of Lauren, her friends started to get a little worried. They started texting her and calling her phone just to see if she was okay. But she never picked up, and she never replied to any of their messages. One of Lauren's classmates eventually reached out to Lauren's sister. She asked her if she had heard from Lauren at all, because no one at school had seen her. Lauren's sister wrote back and told the friend not to worry. She said, "Oh no, everything is just fine. Lauren told us before she left the wedding that she was going to be locking herself away to study around the clock. I'm sure she's just focused. But this classmate wasn't convinced. It felt very uncharacteristic of Lauren not to be at the library, and it was even more strange that she wasn't answering her phone. So she called the police and asked them to do a welfare check at Lauren's apartment. A police officer went over to the apartment and knocked on the door, but there was no answer. He tried the doorknob, but it was locked. The officer then walked around the outside of the building, checking the windows. He didn't see any broken glass or any obvious signs of a break-in. With no reason to force entry, the officer left. He told Lauren's friends that there was nothing more he could do unless they filed an official missing person report. A couple more days went by, and there was still no word from Lauren. At this point, her family was now becoming very concerned. They officially filed a missing persons report. The police went back to Lauren's apartment. Again, they knocked, and again, there was no answer. The door was still locked. This time, they got the owner of the apartment building to come and open the door for them. When they went inside, Lauren wasn't there. At first glance, the apartment looked normal. But then, they noticed something deeply unsettling. Her cell phone, her keys, her purse, and her laptop were all there, left behind. This immediately made the police suspect that something sinister might have happened. They started asking Lauren's friends and family if she had any enemies, or if there was any reason she might be fearful for her life. Initially, everyone said no. They said Lauren was loved by everybody and that no one would ever want to hurt her. But then, Lauren's sister remembered a strange comment Lauren had made about a year earlier. It hadn't seemed important at the time, but now it felt chillingly relevant. Lauren had just gotten back from a vacation, and when she went into her apartment, she noticed that some things had been moved. It felt like someone had been inside while she was away. She told her sister about it, but with no proof and no reasonable explanation, the incident was quickly forgotten. Lauren was so busy with law school that she didn't pursue it. After searching the inside of Lauren's apartment, the police moved their investigation to the exterior of the building. And that's when they made a horrifying discovery. An officer was looking in a dumpster near the building when he noticed a large black trash bag that seemed out of place. When he tried to move it, he realized it was very heavy. The officers opened the bag, and inside they found a human torso. It was later identified as Lauren's. Just moments before this discovery was made, a local news crew had shown up outside the apartment building. They had received a tip that a resident had been missing for over a week and that police were now on the scene. As they were setting up, they saw a young man who appeared to be a resident of the building. He was watching the police investigation and looked visibly shaken. The news crew decided to go over and interview him. It turned out his name was Stephen McDaniel. He was Lauren's next-door neighbor, and he was also a classmate of hers in law school. The interviewer asked Stephen what his last interaction with Lauren had been. Stephen became very focused and explained in detail that he hadn't seen her in the last week. He said, speaking on behalf of his other classmates, that no one had seen her. He then added, she must have just vanished. As they were conducting this interview, just on the other side of a bush, a police officer was discovering Lauren's torso. Word of the discovery quickly spread through the officers on the scene, and the news crew overheard it. The interviewer said out loud to Stephen, "It looks like they found a body." In that instant, Stephen's entire demeanor changed. He just stared at the reporter and said, "A body?" And then he went completely silent. He had a blank, distant look on his face. The interviewer, seeing his reaction, asked him, "Are you okay?" But Stephen just stood there for a few more seconds before walking away from the camera. He sat down on the ground with his back turned to them and began to hyperventilate. The interview was over. Once the case officially shifted from a missing person investigation to a homicide, the police began searching all the rooms on Lauren's floor. Stephen's room was right next to Lauren's, so his was the first one they searched. As they began the search, Stephen stood just outside his open door. He was sweating profusely and drank more than 10 bottles of water in a short period of time. Inside his apartment, they found a master key that opened Lauren's door. They learned that whenever she was gone, he would sneak into her apartment. He would copy the contents of her computer's hard drive and steal small personal items like articles of clothing, which he would hoard in his room. When they examined Stephen's computer, they checked his browser history. It was almost exclusively dedicated to looking at Lauren's Facebook and LinkedIn profiles, but the creepiest thing they found was a camera that had been duct taped to a long pole. On the camera's memory card were surveillance videos of Lauren. He had been using the pole to hoist the camera up to her windows, filming her late at night without her knowledge. Stephen McDaniel was quickly charged with Lauren's murder. He pleaded guilty and openly confessed to the horrific details of what he had done. He told the court that he usually used his spy camera to confirm when Lauren was not in her apartment so he could sneak in. But on the night he killed her, he used it to confirm that she was home and asleep. After watching her for a while, he put on a mask and used his key to let himself into her apartment. He walked quietly into her bedroom, but the sound of his entry woke her up. According to Stephen, she sat up in bed and said, "You need to leave." At that point, he jumped on the bed and attacked her. In the struggle, his mask came off. Lauren recognized him. It was her neighbor, her classmate, Stephen. She pleaded with him, calling him by his name, begging him to stop. But he didn't. He strangled her to death. Afterwards, he dragged her body into her bathroom and dismembered her. Some of the remains were flushed down the toilet. The rest were put into trash bags. Only one of those bags, the one containing her torso, was ever found. Stephen McDaniel was given a life sentence for his crimes. But some of these stories don't really end when the video stops. They stay with the people who lived them. And sometimes they stay with the people who only heard them. Remember, there are more cases waiting for you, stories that seem impossible until you realize they actually happened. Until next time. There is a vast, uncharted region of territory known as the Northwest Territories that may be found at the farthest northernmost part of Canada. This is an area of unadulterated, breathtaking beauty. The globe is filled with vast forests, rugged mountains, and rivers that are both powerful and winding. In order to provide you with an idea of the magnitude of this single land, it is 4 times larger than the entirety of the country of Germany. Nevertheless, the Northwest Territories have a population of approximately 50,000 people, in contrast to Germany, which is home to more than 80 million people. This location is among the most inaccessible, rugged, and sparsely populated areas on the entire planet. A land that is truly wild. In addition, a valley may be found smack dab in the middle of this enormous wilderness. A region of terrain that is 10,000 square miles in size and is so remote and difficult to access that it is thought that there are still parts of it that no human being has ever set foot in. The Nahani Valley is the name given to this location. Over the course of several centuries, the Nahani Valley has been a site of lore, a location that has been discussed in hushed tones between campfires among people. The indigenous peoples of the area have said for a long time that it is a place that should be avoided. Dark ghosts and odd happenings can be found in this location. The Naha were notable for being one of the first known tribes to attempt to establish a home there. The valley was their home for a period of time, but eventually, for reasons that are not clear, they disappeared. Suddenly, they vanished, leaving behind a vibrant community that had been there for a day with them. As if they had just vanished into the thin, chilly air, all of their possessions, including their pottery, their tools, and their dwellings, were left behind. It was only in their writings that they left any traces behind. In their writing, they described odd animals that were pallid and hunted the forests at night. White devils, or Swahila, was the name they gave to them. From the beginning of their writings, they were overwhelmed with an ever-increasing sense of fear regarding these aliens, and suddenly, they simply stopped writing. The Naha had passed away. The other tribes that inhabited in the area did not completely disappear, but they did run away. As they packed up their belongings and left the valley, they vowed that they would never return, therefore establishing the Nahani as a location that was both cursed and forbidden. These were merely thought to be old tales, folklore that was intended to keep people away for a considerable amount of time. At the beginning of the 20th century, however, a sequence of actual events began to take place in the Nahani Valley. The occurrences were so peculiar and terrible that they gave the impression that the old legends might not be legends at all. The true beginning of our story takes place in 1904, with three brothers. Willie, Frank, and Charlie McLeod were the four individuals in question. Gold prospectors who lived and worked in the Northwest Territories were the toughest and most experienced individuals in the industry. It was common knowledge that they were familiar with the tales that were told about the Nahani Valley. They were well aware that it was regarded as a foreboding and even haunted location. In contrast, a gold prospector may view a location that everyone else is too terrified to explore as an opportunity to pursue their interests. Assuming that no one had entered the room, they reasoned that the gold must have been taken by no one. The Nahani Valley is a place that is so beautiful and unspoiled that it is impossible for there not to be gold there. Consequently, the three McLeod brothers made the decision that they were going to be the ones to face the valley, despite the cautions and the horrible legends that were spoken about it. They said their goodbyes to their family, gathered their belongings, and then embarked on their journey through the wilderness. The process of entering the valley was a challenge in and of itself. At that time, there were no highways or actual trails. The decision to travel by boat meant that they would have to endure a difficult trek upriver. They had to cross perilous waters, and at numerous points, they were required to physically disassemble their boat, take the pieces of lumber and their gear up and past large waterfalls, and then reconstruct the boat on the opposite side of the river. Although it was a difficult and grueling process that would have deterred the majority of people, the McLeods were unwavering in their commitment. In due time, the effort that they put in paid off. Ironically, the Flat River is a violent and turbulent river that slices through the middle of the valley. They arrived to the primary waterway that provides access to the valley. In order to find a little section of beachfront where they could beach their boat and set up a camp, they maneuvered through its rapids until they discovered it. They found themselves encircled by enormous mountains and deep trees that were completely silent. Despite the fact that it was a frightening environment, they were there for a specific cause. As they entered the icy river, they retrieved their equipment, including their sluices, and continued their journey. They located it almost shortly after search. Golden. And it's not just a few bits of snow. It was difficult to believe. One might get the impression that the entire riverbed was glistening with it. Over the course of several days, from dawn to dusk, they labored tirelessly to extract an extraordinary quantity of gold from water. This was the score of a lifetime, beyond everything they could have ever imagined achieving. Finally, they had amassed such a large quantity of gold that they were unable to physically transport any more of it. Their boat was completely full, and they were aware that it was time to depart, sell their discoveries, and then make preparations for a subsequent journey. As they began their journey back down the Flat River, they arrived at their destination in a positive frame of mind. They had a lot of money. They were successful in their gamble. It was clear that the valley would not allow them to go without a fight. During the course of their journey across a particularly turbulent stretch of the river, their overloaded boat became entangled in the stream, causing it to capsize. Anything and everything was hurled into the water that was churning in an instant. Despite being drenched in water and shivering, the brothers were able to safely make their way to the shore. As they retrieved their rifles and the few supplies they were able to recover, they discovered that the gold had been completely depleted. It was gone for all time, having sunk to the bottom of the swiftly running river due to its depth. Even though they were in utter disarray, they managed to pull through. They were aware that there was further gold on the other side of that. So they went back to the spot where they had initially set up their tent. They made preparations to begin their journey anew in the morning and put up their tent. They arose early the following morning and once again made their way to the river, returning to the very same location where they had discovered a fortune just a few days before. On the other hand, there was nothing this time. In spite of spending the entire day excavating, sluicing, and hunting for flake, they were unable to locate even a single one. As if the gold had disappeared, the Naha tribe had also disappeared at the same time. They remained for a few more days, but they were aware that they needed to go because their supplies were running low and their boat was no longer available. They were able to live, and they were aware that the valley contained a hidden riches that was sufficient for the time being. They began the long and painful journey out of the valley on foot, packing up what little they had left and packing up their belongings. Willie and Frank, the two younger brothers, were more determined than they had ever been before when they finally made it back to civilization. They had already begun contemplating their subsequent journey. In spite of the fact that they had saw the gold with their own eyes, they were not going to allow a single obstacle to deter them. However, Charlie, the family's oldest brother, had a different opinion. The encounter had left him feeling unsettled. When they were out there by themselves in that huge desert, he couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to passing away. He conveyed to his brothers that he would not be returning. Even though he was certain that they would most likely discover further gold, he wished them luck. However, his time in the Nahani Valley had come to an end. Willie and Frank were dissatisfied, but they were sympathetic to the situation. They discovered a guy named Robert Weir, who was willing to join them in their endeavor. The new Weir family, consisting of Willie, Frank, and Robert Weir, embarked on their journey 1 year later, at the beginning of 1905, with the intention of returning to the Nahani Valley. Everyone in their community was aware of their intended destination and the things they were looking forward to discovering. They did not have a predetermined date for their return. A journey of this nature could have lasted for several months or even a whole year back in those days. You simply went, and by the time you returned, you had already returned. After a few weeks, months passed. It was a shift of seasons. For the entirety of the year, Willie, Frank, and Robert did not communicate with one another in any way. People in the village began to feel anxious, but Charlie, the brother who had remained behind, calmed everyone, removing their concerns. He informed them that his brothers had a lot of experience. They had a sense of what they were doing. He described the valley as challenging but not insurmountable. He reassured everyone that they should not be concerned. On the other hand, another year went by. Now, the year was 1907. Over the course of 2 full years, his brothers had made their way into that valley. Even Charlie was unable to dispute the fact that something was awry at this point. The amount of time that had passed without any communication was simply too lengthy. He was aware that he needed to go and look for them. He assembled a search group consisting of 4 other men, and together they embarked on a journey into the Nahani Valley. They followed the same perilous path that he had traveled with his brothers many years earlier. After leading his men up the flat river, Charlie headed in the direction of the same shoreline where they had slept earlier. Upon arrival at the location, they discovered that his siblings and their camp had vanished without a trace. They proceeded on their way, making further inroads into the valley. At that point, the river made a dramatic turn that was almost 90 degrees, and this location is known as the Big Bend. As a result of this turn, they entered a portion of the valley that is commonly referred to as Second Canyon. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. On either side of them, the walls of the canyon climbed higher, giving the impression of steep cliffs that rose thousands of feet into the sky. Because of the steepness of the walls and the proximity of the walls to the water, there was no space for a boat to land. Once you entered Second Canyon, you were obligated to travel 10 miles in this claustrophobic passageway that was completely dark. The wind howled down the canyon, producing a peculiar sound that was similar to whistling and nearly sounded like a moan. They were able to see the dark holes of hundreds of caverns from a prominent vantage point on the cliff walls, which appeared to be empty eyes watching them pass by. The location felt spooky and frightening to be in. Later on, the guys would assert that they had the unsettling and persistent sensation that they were being observed at all times. As they made their way through the canyon, which was 10 miles long, they searched the water and the cliffs for any indication that the guys had gone missing inside. They were eventually able to emerge from the stifling shadow of Second Canyon, and as they did so, the valley suddenly became more open. This location, once again, included a few isolated stretches of shoreline, and they got a glimpse of it on one of those quaint beaches farther up ahead. It is a tent. Their hearts leapt for joy. While they were calling out the names of Willie and Frank, they navigated their boat in the direction of the beach. They quickly made their way to the campsite when they beached the boat. They noticed a figure sleeping on the ground close to some trees as they came closer to the position. It was a man who was unconscious and lying on his back, with his arm extended in a manner that suggested he was attempting to grab the weapon that was leaning against a nearby tree. After that, they discovered another body, this one lying face down and partially within the tent and partially outside of it. They were getting closer as the horrific reality of the situation grew more and more apparent. The heads of both of the males were out of place. Charlie was able to determine the identities of the deceased by using personal belongings that were discovered at the camp. Willie and Frank were his brothers. They were his brothers. Robert Weir seemed to be nowhere to be found. A search group went around the camp looking for anything. The etching was discovered by them cut into the tree at the location where the weapon was leaning. It stated, "We have found a fine prospect." This gave the impression that they had discovered gold. Nevertheless, a comprehensive investigation of the camp and the riverbank in the vicinity led to the discovery of nothing. There was not a single ounce of gold ever discovered. The event was really unsettling to witness. One of the brothers was obviously reaching for his firearm at the time of his death. It seemed as though the other individual had been attempting to escape from the tent. Moreover, their heads were completely absent. After collecting as much information as they could, Charlie and his men left the valley, bearing the weighty news of what they had discovered before them. They informed the mounted police about all that had happened. The authorities began their own inquiry into the matter. However, despite the fact that they discovered another skeleton a little distance downstream, which was also missing its head, they refused to identify it as belonging to Robert Weir. The official conclusion that they came to was that Willie and Frank had simply passed out due to malnutrition and that animals had taken their heads off of them. Charlie was angry with rage. He was well aware that this was not logical. What was written on the tree, where the bodies were located, and what was missing from the heads. As a whole, it indicated that there was something violent and something sinister. The case, however, was resolved. On the other hand, the news quickly traveled throughout the Northwest Territories like wildfire to everyone. A horrifying new chapter had been added to the story of the valley that was said to be cursed. Additionally, beginning on that day, the region of the Nahani Valley that encompassed Second Canyon all the way to the location where the McLeod brothers were discovered was renamed accordingly. Eventually, people began to refer to it as the Headless Valley. A small number of people had the courage to trek inside the Nahani during the subsequent few years. In addition to being too recent, the narrative of the McLeod brothers was also too terrifying. In order to entice people to enter a location where men lost their heads, the promise of wealth was not sufficient attraction. But recollections are short-lived, and greed is a potent driver of behavior. 5 years after the brothers were discovered, in 1913, a prospector by the name of Martin Jorgensen made the decision that he was courageous enough, or perhaps foolish enough, to try his luck at finding the brothers. As a solitary individual, he was a hardy outdoorsman who was confident in his ability to deal with anything the valley had in store for him. At a distance of approximately 70 miles from the Headless Valley, he ventured into the Nahani region by himself, and, rather than establishing a temporary camp, he constructed a modest and durable hut for himself. Because he was confident that he would make his fortune there, he intended to remain for an entire year. And it appeared that he was correct for a period of time. Due to the fact that he was able to communicate the news to his business associates, we are aware that he discovered gold. A straightforward and victorious message was sent. It seemed as though he had hit it rich. Once a year had passed, he instructed them to meet him at a location that had been prearranged outside of the valley. After a year had passed, his companions made their way to the scheduled meeting location. Even though they waited, Martin Jorgensen did not appear at any point. Due to the fact that this was absolutely out of character, his partners made the decision to descend into the valley in order to locate him. They were armed with the directions that he had sent. As they continued to follow his track, they were eventually able to locate the site of his cabin. However, the cabin was no longer there. What was left behind was nothing more than a heap of burnt wood and ash. It had been entirely consumed by fire and gone up in flames. In addition, the decapitated body of Martin Jorgensen was discovered lying on the ground close to the decaying remains of the cabin. To reiterate, there was no gold to be discovered anywhere in the area. It was decided to call in the mounted police once more. Yet another investigation was carried out by them. Again, they came up with an explanation that was completely in line with the natural world. They came to the conclusion that Jorgensen must have used his stove in a way that caused an accident, which was the cause of the fire. Predation by animals was the cause of the missing head, as was the case with the lost head. It was yet another case that had been resolved, yet another horrible event that occurred in the harsh woods. However, the trend was becoming increasingly difficult for many people to ignore. 8 years later, in 1921, John O'Brien and an anonymous partner, 2 other prospectors, made the decision to test their luck and see what would happen. Despite the fact that they were aware of the tales, they were of the belief that there was a return for every risk. The Headless Valley itself was not too far away from where they established their tent. And very immediately, they discovered gold, just like the others had done. They disseminated the news that they had achieved their goals and that they intended to remain for a considerable amount of time. It had been a couple of weeks since they had begun their journey, and they were getting low on food. Along the path that they used to enter the valley, they had placed a number of animal traps in various locations. For the purpose of examining the traps, John O'Brien informed his partner that he was going to make the journey. It was a lengthy trek that would take him 8 or 9 days to complete, and it was a circuit. For the sake of protecting their wealth and supplies, his partner remained in the camp with them. In spite of the passage of 9 days, John O'Brien did not come back. His companions started to feel concerned about him. It was by accident that he came upon another solitary prospector who was in the vicinity, and the 2 men decided to undertake the mission of searching for O'Brien together. They continued to call his name as they followed the line of traps. They walked for a considerable amount of time. At the moment when the sun was beginning to drop, they entered a tiny clearing. One of the fallen logs was located in the middle of the clearing. In addition, there was a man who was seated on the log with his back to them. "John, is that you?" they yelled out, but there was no response to their question. Completely still, the figure remained in that position. They moved closer with increased caution. They made their way around the log, and as they did so, they saw that it was, in fact, John O'Brien. He was sitting in an upright position, his demeanor uninterested, and he was simply staring into the ashes of a small bonfire that had been extinguished at his feet. He had a book of matches in his hand, and he was holding it tightly. In addition, he had been fully and utterly frozen to death. It was a peculiar fact that the temperature had not been very low. The police, who later inspected the site, said in their report that it appeared as though he had been slain so suddenly that he had no time to react, no time to even realize what was happening. They said that it was as if he had been flash frozen. In the midst of the forest, he remained still, like a statue completely frozen in place. At this point, the stories were stacking up. Burned cabins, headless bodies, and a guy frozen solid make up the scene. The authorities continued to explain that each of these instances was distinct and unrelated to one another, and that they were simply the brutal facts of living in the wild. However, the general public was not entirely convinced. There was a widespread consensus that the Nahani Valley was a haunted and cursed location at this point. Then, in the year 1926, an event that was both one of the most peculiar and chilling of all time occurred. In the valley, a wealthy hunting party made their entrance. There were perhaps 12 of them, and they were being guided by an experienced guide. It was their belief that there was protection in numbers. They established their camp in close proximity to the river, not too far from the Headless Valley. Nothing of note happened on the first day. After going on a hunt, they went back to their camp and spent the evening around a large bonfire, enjoying each other's company while exchanging stories. They awoke the following morning to discover that one of their party members had vanished without a trace. Annie Lafferty, a young woman, became absent from the scene. She had not yet removed her possessions from her tent. There was no note, and there was no indication that there had been a struggle. In the middle of the night, she had simply disappeared without a trace. The group spent the entire day looking for her, searching the woods and shouting her name numerous times, but they were unable to locate any trace of her. Eventually, they were forced to leave the valley and declare her missing to the authorities. An extensive and official search procedure was initiated. Because her family was so powerful and wealthy, they spared no cost in their spending. But after a number of weeks of hunting, they came up empty-handed. The valley itself seemed to have engulfed Annie Lafferty, as if she had been consumed by it. A man named Charlie, who was known for his solitude and his love of the outdoors, was found in a pub in one of the smaller villages located in the Northwest Territories a few months later. Some men were discussing the mysterious disappearance of Annie Lafferty, and he overheard them talking about it. A look of horror appeared on his face as he listened to the specifics of the incident, including the date and the location. It dawned on him that he had been present. Something had been observed by him. His astonishing narrative was promptly relayed to the authorities, and he went to the police station. During the period when the hunting team was stationed in the Nahani Valley, he explained that he had been camping by himself in the valley. Even in the evening, he was close enough to them that he could hear their voices. He was not too far away. It was the night that Annie vanished, and he claimed that he was unable to sleep. It was while he was sitting outside his tent that he became aware of a peculiar sound. The sound that could be heard was that of little rocks being dropped into the river, one after the other. The sound was not a natural one, like the sound of rock slides. It appeared to be intentional. He stood up and made his way towards the riverbank in a stealthy manner in order to gain a better glimpse. It was a full moon, and it was shining brightly, which illuminated the area. He turned his gaze downstream, in the direction of the position of the hunting party's camp. He then became aware of it. A woman was climbing up a high, rocky ridge that ran alongside the river while she was absolutely naked. She was on all fours. Unlike a coyote, she was traveling at an unnaturally fast speed, similar to that of an animal. Both her hands and her feet were responsible for the dislodging of small stones, which then fell down the bank and splashed into the river with each step that she took. His ears had been picking up on that particular sound. He stood there, still, observing her in silence. It seemed to him that she was completely insane, and that she would perish from exposure out there. Nevertheless, she came to a halt just as she reached the highest point of the ridge. It appeared as though she was looking right at him when she moved her head. In addition, Charlie reported to the authorities that her face had been contorted into a frightening and inhumane grimace. As he described it, her eyes appeared to be utterly possessed. Because he was so afraid, he stumbled backward and hurried back to his tent, where he might find refuge from the danger. Over the crest of the ridge, the woman disappeared without a trace. Charlie was shown an image of Annie Lafferty, the woman who had gone missing, despite the fact that the police were still doubtful. Without any sign of doubt, he acknowledged it. He had seen the woman rushing naked on all fours into the dark core of the Nahani Valley. That was the woman he had seen. There was no further sighting of Annie. The number of victims proceeded to reach new heights. In 1931, a prospector by the name of Phil Powers constructed a cabin, discovered gold, and then vanished without a trace. His charred cabin was discovered by a search party that had been sent out. Although the body of Powers was found inside, the investigation discovered that the fire had begun on the roof, which indicates that he would have had a sufficient amount of time to flee the building. As a result, it was determined that it was highly probable that he had already passed away inside his cabin before the fire even began. The year 1936 saw the disappearance of two other prospectors, namely William Epper and Joseph Mulholland. In addition, their cottage was discovered to be completely destroyed by fire. However, this time there were no remains found at all. Simply put, they had disappeared. At the campsite where he was staying in 1945, the body of a guy named Ernest Sabard was discovered inside his sleeping bag. Additionally, he was a prospector who had vanished without a trace. The search crew discovered him without his head when they found him. The year 1946 saw the occurrence of the last important incident. An additional large search party was dispatched to the area in an effort to locate a missing prospector by the name of John Patterson. The individual who was in charge of this search party was a man who was resolute, unyielding, and unwavering in his commitment to unraveling the enigma. They established their fortifications in the Headless Valley, which was the same region in which the McLeod brothers had been discovered. They were sitting around their fire one evening when, all of a sudden, a man emerged from the shade of the forest. The native man wore traditional garb and was dressed in traditional garb. Immediately, he approached the person who was in charge of the search party. His name was not disclosed by him. This is a terrifying warning that he just issued. After that, he informed them that they had to depart the valley without delay. According to him, there were white creatures that were walking around in the woods all around them, and they were very close to their camp. Before the leader of the search group could ask any questions, the man turned around, walked back into the forest, and vanished without a trace. All of the members of the search team were terrified that night by the horrific sounds that emanated from the forest that were all around them. In addition to the sound of enormous trees smashing to the ground, they heard screams and wails that went through their bodies. It was reported by a few of the men that they had witnessed tall white figures moving between the trees that were located on the edge of the firelight. As soon as the sun rose the following morning, they decided to give up their hunt for John Patterson and get away from the valley completely. In a later statement, the leader of the party, the individual who had entered the valley with such a high level of self-assurance, stated that he had never been more terrified in his entire life and that he would never again set foot in that valley. We were never able to locate John Patterson. After that, it appeared as though the odd occurrences in the Nahani Valley had stopped. However, this is primarily due to the fact that people stopped going in. There were now too many of them, they were too consistent, and they were too terrifying to remain ignored. Thereafter, in the year 1976, the government of Canada took an unusual action. National park status was bestowed upon the Nahani Valley by the government. On the surface, it appeared as though this was a move to preserve the natural beauty of the area. In contrast, if you examine the park's regulations in greater detail, you will notice something peculiar. The area does not have any tourist facilities, visitor centers, or trails that are clearly marked. And perhaps most importantly, there are significant portions of the park that have been designated as being completely off-limits to visitors. Nobody is permitted to enter these areas at any time. Neither visitors nor researchers, and not even employees of the park. In addition, the Headless Valley serves as the focal point of the largest of these restricted areas. There is still a legal prohibition against entering the very locations where all of these strange and horrifying events took place, and this prohibition continues to this day. There are a lot of people who think that the government did not establish the park in order to protect the valley from people. They are under the impression that it was designed to shield people from whatever is located in the valley. Annie Lafferty continued to be a mystery, and the mystery of what happened to all of those prospectors has not been solved. The Nahani Valley is a place where no one is permitted to look, and it is there that the valley conceals its information. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you saw today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time, what's up?